At the outset, I welcome you all to this online conference organized by the Department of History, St. Joseph's Evening College. As we all know, the theme for this conference is Challenges to Secularism in India in the 21st Century. Keeping in mind and in the light of the developments happening in the society, we thought organizing the conference on this particular theme would be more relevant and it makes more sense. So we wrote the proposal to ICSSR and they were generous enough to accept the proposal and to fund to organize this particular conference. And to address you all, today we have the very good resource persons, and it's a 2-day online national conference. And the instructions have already been given to all the participants. So I request you all to remain in the session till end and to attend the session on today and tomorrow and contribute to the success. And I hope that we'll have fruitful session and fruitful discussion, and we will be benefited from this particular conference. To begin with, we have to start the proceedings of today's conference with a prayer. I request Professor Marian ma'am to lead us into prayer.
Good morning, everyone. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you're audible.
Let us close our eyes in prayer and become aware of the presence of the divine. As we gather here today, let us pray for the success of this conference. May we and our communities be blessed with love that is unconditional, joy that overflows, and peace that is beyond understanding. May love, joy, peace, and understanding flow from within ourselves to the world around us, so that we may be catalysts for the creation of a just and inclusive society. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Professor Marian. I now request Professor Yashwanta to welcome all the dignitaries, all the resource persons of today's session. And Professor Yashwanta, over to you.
Now I would like to welcome our resource persons for today's sessions. Firstly, I would like to welcome Dr. D. Jeevan Kumar, Honorary Professor, Karnataka State Rural Development and Panchayat Raj University, Gadag. He is our keynote speaker. I'd also like to welcome Dr. Shashidhar Yam, Professor, Department of History, Bangalore University, who will deliver the lead lecture. I'd also like to welcome Dr. Ashwath Narayana, Professor, Retired, Department of History, Bangalore University, to the conference. I'd also like to welcome Professor Subhashini, Dean of the School of Social Sciences, Jain University. I'd also like to welcome Professor M.V. Ushadevi of Bangalore University. I'd also like to welcome Father Maxim Dias, SJ, and Dr. Albert Smith of St. Joseph's Evening College. Thank you, everyone. Have a pleasant day.
Thank you, Mr. Yashwanta. And I request Ms. Marian ma'am to introduce the speaker of this session and go ahead with the.
Thank you, sir. It gives me great pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker for today, Dr. D. Jeevan Kumar. Dr. Jeevan Kumar attained superannuation from Bangalore University as Professor of Political Science in 2016. His area of specialization includes Indian government and politics, developmental politics and administration, and Gandhian studies. He was a Fulbright Fellow in the USA in 2003. He was invited to deliver guest lectures at the United Nations at the United Nations, Tokyo in 2007 and 2008. He has edited several books, including The Angry Voter, Uniting in Responsibilities in a Culture of Rights, and Excellence in Administration, Prospects and Perspectives. He is currently the Honorable Professor at the Karnataka State Rural Development and Panchayat Raj University, Gadag, Chairman Civic Bangalore, and Vice Chairman of the Karnataka chapter of the Sarvodaya International Trust. On behalf of the management and organizations, the organizers, sir, I welcome you and thank you for addressing us today. Before I hand over to sir, I would like to request the participants to share any questions and comments that they have in the chat, and they will be addressed to the speaker at the end of the lecture. Thank you. Over to you, sir.
At the outset, thank Father Brian Pereira, Director of St. Joseph's Evening College, Dr. Paul Newman, Principal of the college, for inviting me specifically on day one to deliver the keynote address. Paul, thank you. Is Paul Newman with us, Mahesh? I can't...
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sir is with us.
Okay, Paul. I couldn't see you, so I was wondering where you were. Anyway, thank you, Paul, for the invitation. I must thank Mahesh, who has been coordinating with me in putting this whole thing together. Thank you, Mahesh. It's a good initiative from your college side to request the ICSSR to sponsor this national conference on a very important theme. Obviously, the theme has gone down well. Your choice of theme has gone down well with the ICSSR. Challenges to secularism in India in the 21st century. And that's a very contemporary, very relevant theme. And I'm happy that you've got the ICSSR to back you. Let me also acknowledge the presence of my former colleagues at Bangalore University. Dr. Shashidhar, I think, is coming on after me. Dr. Ashwath Narayan comes on a little later. I noticed Dr. Usha Devi having already joined in. Dr. Suhasini, good to see you once again. Dr. Albert Smith, Father Maxim Dias, and a host of others who have joined here. A warm welcome to all of you, and I do hope that you will be able to follow what I'm trying to share with you this morning. I'll speak for about half an hour to 40 minutes at most, and my time actually begins at 11, but we've started earlier. Nonetheless, I think I won't take too much of your time. I have some points to share with you, so I may take half an hour, maybe up to 40 minutes, and I would appreciate questions and interventions from the floor. You could put it on the chat box, and we could have a discussion at the end of my presentation. So let me give you the outline of my presentation at the beginning. There are three sections to my presentation. The first is titled Articulation of the Idea of Secularism. I'll spend a little time sharing with you what I think is important in our understanding of the idea of secularism in India. That's the first part of my presentation. The second part will directly address the theme of this conference, challenges to secularism in India. So the second part, in the second part, I would be identifying a few challenges to Indian secularism today. I will be taking the help of some scholars in this regard, and I'll briefly present before you the synopsis of their arguments. That's the second part of my outline. And the last part, which is titled Religion in Post-Secular India, is what I think would be able to provoke your curiosity, provoke your interest. And perhaps I'm guessing that most of your interventions, your questions to me would be directed or would be based upon the third section of my presentation, Religion in Post-Secular India. I've deliberately made this a little controversial. I'm making an observation that the era of secularism in India is over based upon what we are seeing happening around us. And I am saying that we have entered in a fairly big way the era of post-secular India. Why am I saying this? I'll explain when I come to that particular section. And if you are able to see the point that I'm making, perhaps you will be able to appreciate a few suggestions that I would be making at the end of my presentation. So these are the three sections. I would be taking perhaps about 10 minutes to share my thoughts on each of these three sections. So here I go. This is the first part of my presentation. As I told you, whether it's important for us, since we're looking at secularism, we're looking at challenges to secularism. I think it's important that we are clear how we went about the process of articulation of the idea of secularism in our country. And this is where I would restrict myself to the immense contribution of two of the great nation builders of India, Mahatma Gandhi and Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. And I'm saying here that the contribution of two of these stalwarts to the idea of secularism in India, both in conceptual terms and in practical terms, is immense. It's important that we are able to appreciate their contribution to India. I'm quoting Maxim Dias is here with us. Maxim, I'm quoting from your doctoral thesis. For those of you who don't know, Father Maxim Dias has...
Hello.
Yeah, hi, Maxim. I'm beholden to you for the first two parts of my presentation, and I must acknowledge it, so I'm doing it openly. This is the title, friends, of Maxim Dias' thesis, Impact of Religious Extremism on Indian Secularism, based on a case study of Dakshin Kannada. Maxim Dias has been easily one of my...
Sorry, I have a very poor connection. I'm not able to hear. Kindly go ahead.
Okay, Maxim. Okay. I thought I would acknowledge the fact that I've borrowed quite a bit from your thesis. I was just telling the audience that you have been easily one of my best doctoral research candidates. I'm very happy with the thesis that you presented, and the fact that even the examiners were appreciative of the work that you've done. So I'm quoting from Maxim Dias' thesis here, where he says it is impossible to think of the secular state in India without the tremendous contribution of Gandhi's syncretism and Nehru's Indian idea of secularism. This is a direct quote from Maxim Dias' thesis, and I think it's important that we begin our discussion of the idea of secularism in India by appreciating the huge contribution both of Gandhi as well as Nehru. Not to say that others have not made their contribution, but these are two of, I think, of our greatest minds. And when Maxim Dias says Gandhi's syncretism is a big contribution, we have to look at what Gandhi meant by syncretism. I'll explain a bit of that. And then Nehru's Indian idea of secularism, with both Gandhi's syncretism and Nehru's Indian idea of secularism, I will go into a few of those details. So let's understand and appreciate the fact that these two stalwarts of the Indian freedom movement and stalwarts of Indian secularism, Gandhi and Nehru, both of them projected the secular state as the cornerstone of the Indian political system. This they were very clear about. There are no two ways about it. When a new India was being created after the exit of the British, when the constitution was being drafted, when ideas about the proposed constitution of India and what should be the cornerstones of the Indian political system, when these were being discussed, we find a huge influence of both Gandhi and Nehru, because they were very clear in their minds that the secular state should be the cornerstone of the Indian political system. A few thoughts about Nehruvian socialism first. The connection to scientific humanism, I think, should not be lost sight of here, because his socialism, his secularism, you find based upon scientific humanism. Coming to Nehruvian secularism, Nehru insisted on the separation of religion and politics. And it is in this context that we find expression of this concept that Nehruvian secularism is all about, dharma nirpekshata, which is Nehru's contribution to Indian secularism, where he said that there must be a clear separation of religion from politics. So this concept of dharma nirpekshata is important for us to keep in mind at this point of time. Gandhian secularism was obviously not the same as how Nehru visualizes secularism. Gandhian secularism clearly was based on a commitment to brotherhood, sisterhood of religious communities, because Gandhi believed in the principle of equal respect for all religions. Those of you who have read Gandhi's autobiography would be able to appreciate the fact that Gandhi very clearly mentions there, and in many of his subsequent writings, that he, although he prided himself as being a part and parcel of Hinduism, that the Hindu religious texts, particularly Bhagavad Gita and so on, inspired him, especially when he required a certain kind of inspiration. Gandhi also says that he spent a lot of time. He did this in England, he did it in South Africa, he did it when he was incarcerated in the prisons in India and in South Africa, that he went through religious books of the other big religions and was able to absorb the essence of those religions. And therefore, to say that Gandhi believed in the principle of equal respect for all religions would not be untrue at all. And the concept of dharma sambhava that Gandhi, that we associate with Gandhi, is the result of the fact that he was able to absorb the essence of the big religions after reading their holy texts. In fact, when he received some texts which were not in the original language but in English, especially the Bhagavad Gita in London, you may recall, those of you who read his autobiography may recall that in London he receives a copy of the Bhagavad Gita, but that was in English. And he writes in his autobiography that he was not happy to read the Bhagavad Gita in English, that he was looking forward to reading the Bhagavad Gita in Sanskrit. Okay, Gandhi held regular prayer meetings where he included bhajans of all religions. Now, even today, if you go to Gandhian ashrams, you will find that there are regular prayers both in the morning and the evening. And these are some of the favorite bhajans of Gandhiji, which I'm sure many of you would be conscious of, familiar with. Raghupati, Raghava Raja Ram, and Ishwar Allah Tero Naam were two of the bhajans that simply delighted Gandhi because of the eclectic nature of the bhajans, because of the fact that the argument, the idea that the bhajans were expressing was the fact that there is one universal creator. One may call him by different names. One may worship the creator in different forms, in different fashions. You may call him by different names, Ishwar, Allah, and so on and so forth. But then they all represent one. They all represent one creator. Okay, so this is Gandhian secularism, and we know that Gandhi laid the foundation for a syncretic perspective religion. He also writes in his biography and elsewhere that the ability of a person, a citizen of India, to read through the scriptures of these languages, to be able to understand what the scriptures were talking about, and to be able to perhaps devise a new perspective to religion itself. By being, you could be a Muslim, you could be a Hindu, you could be a Christian, but then once you are aware of the essence of the religious texts of other religions, one is able to develop. Gandhi developed this beautifully. Gandhi was able to inspire his followers beautifully by imparting in them, by giving to them, by telling them that it's important for each one of us in this society, multicultural, multi-religious society of ours, to adopt a syncretic perspective to religion. When Gandhi does this, he gives a unique flavor to Indian secularism, which we must not forget on an occasion like this. I'll go back and forth to Gandhi and Nehru initially. Nehru has been described as the architect of Indian secularism, and I wouldn't have any difficulty in going along with this particular observation. Chester Bowles, the ambassador of US ambassador to India, says that the creation of India as a secular state was one of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru's greatest achievements. And here again, I don't think we should have any dispute about the achievements of Nehru, although attempts are being made to underestimate or to downgrade or even to eliminate the contribution of Nehru to the to nation building in this country. Nehru was clearly able to reinterpret. Nehru was able to appropriate the Western idea of secularism to the Indian context. And this is what even Maxim Dias has said in his thesis. How far other scholars are able to appreciate the statement, I'll be able to place this before you when I go to the second part of my presentation. But a lot of us, and I go along with Maxim when he says this, that to appreciate Nehru's contribution to secularism by saying that we had before us this Western idea of secularism. The word secularism itself, many people continue to tell us, is not indigenous. It is not unique to our part of the world. It's something that came to us from the Western world, something that came to us from the Christian world, Christian countries. Okay, but to be able to look at that Western idea of secularism, to be able to interpret it in a fashion that it would suit our requirements. Effectively, what Nehru was doing was to appropriate this Western idea of secularism and locating it in the Indian context, or appropriating it to suit the Indian context. Now, this is a huge contribution of Nehru, and I'm saying this needs to be flagged by us on this particular occasion. What was Nehruvian secularism all about? This historian Bipin Chandra says that Nehruvian secularism was four-pronged in nature, and the four prongs are depicted here. The first prong implying a separation of religion from political, economic, social, and cultural aspects of life. The argument that religion is a purely personal matter. Many of us still continue to hold this particular view. This is the first prong of Nehruvian secularism, and he tried immensely to do this, both particularly as the first Prime Minister of India, a little before that, and during his tenure, we are able to recall incidents, recall his speeches, recall from his writings how he very firmly believed in the fact that there must be a clear separation of religion from all other aspects of life. And his argument that religion is a purely personal matter. Let's keep religion within our domestic walls. When we come out into other spaces, we should not carry religion to those spaces. Now, this is the first of the prongs of Nehruvian secularism, according to Bipin Chandra. The second prong, according to him, is the Nehruvian desire to disassociate the state from religion. Here, a clear separation of the state from religion, obviously borrowed from the Western concept of secularism, where the church and the state were to be kept very clearly distinct. I'm not going into details there. Many of you would be familiar with this, but Nehru says that, well, if that is how the Western world wanted it to be done, well, it should happen. If we believe in the establishment of secular state, then it's very important that the state steers or keeps itself away from religion. There should not be an officially prescribed religion, that the state maintains equidistance from religious communities. There may be so many of them in multicultural societies, but the state keeps a healthy distance from them, and so on and so forth. So this is the second of the prongs, as Bipin Chandra tells us. The third of the prongs is, while the state disassociates itself from religion, the state allows full freedom to all religions. The state affords tolerance. The state very clearly emphasizes the fact that there must be tolerance of all religions practiced in multi-religious societies like ours. So the second and the third are intertwined. In case one looks at the second of the prongs of Nehruvian secularism, one may think that this could be detrimental to the development of religions, or it may be detrimental to the freedom that religions and their adherents are expected to enjoy. There is no such restriction on the freedom of religion to do whatever they like. At the same time, one religion tolerates the other religions, although I don't like this word tolerance, but then this has got into our dictionary, so I may use it here and there. Equal respect perhaps would be a better term to use instead of tolerance, because tolerance gives a feeling of, gives a certain feeling which makes me a little uncomfortable. But Bipin Chandra uses this, and I've used it here. And the fourth of the prongs of Nehruvian secularism, according to Bipin Chandra, is that the state would give equal opportunities for followers of all religions to do what they like. There is no discrimination on ground of religion. So these are intertwined. And when one looks at each of these four prongs of Nehruvian secularism, one may be able to get a better idea of what we're talking about here. But these 4-5 bullet points, I think, would be able to, would help us to understand Nehruvian secularism better. Because when this question is posed to Jawaharlal Nehru, the question, what is it that holds India together? And what is it that should continue to hold India together? We have writing in his Discovery of India and elsewhere that these are the 4 or 5 strands that hold India together. And it's important on this occasion that we also look at these 4 or 5 strands. It is plurality, not uniformity, that holds India together. It is inclusion, not exclusion, that holds India together. It is secularism, not orthodoxy, that holds India together, not communalism, that will obviously hold India together. It is pluralism, not majoritarianism, that holds India together, and it's not incongruity that holds India together. Okay, so this is also important for us to recall here, because you can find that the first Prime Minister of independent India had such a liberal idea of secularism, understood the nature of a society, understood the nature of religion in a society, and therefore says that unless we pledge ourselves to ensuring that plurality, inclusion, secularism, harmony are reinforced, it will not be possible to keep this country together. So Gandhi's secular vision of Sarva Dharma Sambhava, Nehru's Dharma Nirpekshata, today are obviously under threat. So this brings me to the end of the first section. If you're able to understand what Gandhi and Nehru had to contribute to the development, to the reinforcement of secularism in India, I think we should appreciate, we should obviously be alive to the reality that these noble concepts that our great leaders believed in are today increasingly under threat. So this brings me to the theme of this national conference, directed at the challenges to Indian secularism, and therefore I'm posing a question here: how do we understand the challenges to Indian secularism in the 21st century? This brings me to the second part of my discussion with you this morning, which is titled Challenges to Indian Secularism Today. And there are 6 important scholars whom Maxim Dias had picked up. I'm again basing the arguments that these 6 scholars have made. There are a few other scholars who Maxim Dias has picked up, but then I'm looking at 6 of them and referring to their interpretation of Indian secularism. And these are big names, be it Rajiv Bhargav, be it Ashish Nandi, be it T.N. Madan, be it Akil Bilgrami, Bhikkhu Parekh, or Amartya Sen. These are big names. And these are scholars who have looked at Indian secularism very carefully. They have looked at what Nehru tried to bring into secularism. They looked at what Gandhi tried to do with secularism and so on. Now, if the theme of this conference is looking at the challenges to Indian secularism today, and figuring out how exactly we're going to address these challenges, then I think this webinar ought to look at the positions taken by these 5 or 6 great scholars and what they have to say about the challenges or the threats to Indian secularism today. So let's begin with Rajiv Bhargav, and the works of Rajiv Bhargav that are referred to are 2 here. One, The Promise of India's Secular Democracy, and second, Reimagining Secularism. Now, these are 2 works of Rajiv Bhargav which would help us to understand his position, the position that he takes as far as Indian secularism is concerned. So he says, Rajiv Bhargava is telling us that though the idea of secularism is a Western contribution, our societies in our part of the world, South Asian societies particularly, have added many dimensions to it. And this phrase of contextual secularism is a phrase that many of you or some of you would be familiar with. So this is Rajiv Bhargava's unique contribution to secularism, where he says that the Western understanding of secularism would not be applicable to secularism in other parts of the world, in South Asian societies and in Eastern societies, because that is a Western contribution, is a Western construct. We may have similar desires, but then secularism cannot be blindly imported. Secularism cannot be, you cannot do a cut and paste of secularism onto your multicultural societies in other parts of the world. So the term that Rajiv Bhargava uses is contextual secularism, where he says that the form of secularism, the content of secularism would vary from one context to the other. So if you're looking at Indian secularism today, we got to understand the form of Indian secularism, we got to understand the content of Indian secularism. And this is a big contribution, contextual secularism, the concept that Rajiv Bhargava has given us. If one were to ask Rajiv Bhargava, how would he or how would one define contextual secularism? Rajiv Bhargava tells us that you cannot define it so very clearly. You can't give a statement, give a sentence and say this is contextual secularism, because that would defeat the very purpose of his expression, contextual secularism. As he says, as he has said in his writings, it requires fresh interpretations. It requires contextual judgments. You look at judgments of the judiciary here, judgments again to be looked in context. You've got to look at attempts which were made, which continue to be made at compromise and reconciliation, and so on. So Rajiv Bhargava is telling us that it's not possible to define, to very precisely define or to understand contextual secularism, because it requires all these different attempts to be done. And as a fallout of the fact that you cannot define or understand contextual secularism, that is so very relative, that interpretations of contextual secularism today may not be the same interpretation that you may adopt at a different point of time. Judgments of judiciary also may vary from case to case and so on. Therefore, one conclusion of Rajiv Bhargava when he's speaking of this concept is the fact that implicit in contextual secularism are instability, are internal discord. For the reasons that I've just explained to you, he said this is implicit, and therefore if you're understanding, if you're trying to ask the question, why is secularism in India in such a predicament? Why has it not taken firm root despite attempts made by Gandhi, Nehru and a few others? Well, Rajiv Bhargava's explanation is implicit in the kind of secularism that we adopted in our country are instability as well as internal discord. Now, that is of Rajiv Bhargava. I've summarized very briefly what he has tried to tell us. The second scholar I'd like to spend some time with, again very briefly, is Ashish Nandi. When in his work, The Politics of Secularism, he gives answers to the question that we are trying to find answers to today. How does one explain the rise of identity politics, assuming such communal overtones, violent overtones? How do we explain the rise of communal violence today? And his answers to these questions are there before you. When one tries to impose Western secularism on non-Western societies, well, you have the rise of identity politics, you have the rise of communal violence. When you try to impose a concept of religious tolerance, which people may not appreciate, well, you have identity politics surfacing, you have communal violence surfacing, and when you have Indian middle class coming up with contradictory aspirations, again, you have the problem of the rise of identity politics, the rise of communal violence. So this is Ashish Nandi telling us, or giving us answers to the question, why are we so divided today? Why are religions at each other's throats? Why is one religion trying to put all other religions on the back foot and so on? Some answers to that question you have in Ashish Nandi's Politics of Secularism. Ashish Nandi goes a step further and tells us that religious fanaticism, religious violence stem from these two or three forces and factors. One, a sense of defeat of the believers. You believe in a particular religion and you think that that religion is on the ascendancy. You believe that that religion should hold forth. You believe that that religion should rule the day and so on. Now, when these things don't happen in the state, or when others believe in coexistence, or believe in peaceful coexistence of all religions and so on, you have these diehard believers feeling a sense of defeat. This is Ashish Nandi telling us that this sense of defeat of the adherents of the believers, and their feelings of impotence when they see a kind of placation of minority religions, when they see certain concessions be given to other religions, well, their feelings of impotence, this sense of defeat, feeling of impotence emerges as free-floating anger, self-hatred, and this in the public domain expresses itself in the form in which we are seeing it today. So this is Ashish Nandi having diagnosed the problems that we're facing today, challenges to Indian secularism today, then telling us that we need to look at secularism. No, it's not telling us this. He's saying that when the state calls for secularization, when the state calls for modernization, when sane voices are trying to tell these communal forces, I think we have not secularized enough. This country should secularize more. This country should modernize more. You find that these forces are not able to appreciate that. There's resentment, there's anger, and then you find aggressive politicization of religious identity. Ashish Nandi is important to me here because he has diagnosed, perhaps in a much better way than some of the other scholars, why one particular religion today is on the ascendancy, why it is saying and doing things that during the first couple of decades, or the first few decades of Indian independence, could not even be visualized, could not even be thought of. That is Ashish Nandi. A quick summary of what he told us. I'm moving to the third scholar, T.N. Madan, in two of his works, one, Secularism in Its Place, and the other one, Modern Myths, Locked Minds. He tells us that secularism is essentially a Protestant idea. Now all of you are studying institutions, and from your names I can make out that a good many of you are Christians here. So I don't have to really go into this statement here of T.N. Madan's. The secularism is essentially a Protestant idea. If you look at the emergence of secularism, the need for a distinction between the church and the state, you will see that the Protestant reformism, reformist movement, the Renaissance, the Age of Enlightenment, all these things come into the idea of coming to the movement that Protestantism brought to the forefront in Western Christian civilizations or in societies. And therefore, secularism is an outcome of this clear-cut need for emphasis on the clear-cut distinction between church and the state. Okay, so therefore it is a Protestant idea. But if secularism is essentially a Protestant idea, how could we import this, or how would it suit the other religions in other continents, especially in this part of the world? So Madan is telling us that secularism simply does not suit either Hinduism or Islam, Buddhism, or even Sikhism, because he very clearly says in his writings, Madan, that secularism cannot be translated, cannot be imported, particularly in the Indian context. It cannot be translocated to the Indian culture. This is Madan's argument. The question, why is Madan saying this? You have some answers here. Madan is telling us that in India, has there been any radical antinomy between the sacred and the secular? To this question, Madan says, no, there has been no diarchy of this particular kind, or the antinomy, or this distinction between sacred and the secular. Religion in India has covered all aspects of life. And then once we become independent and we bring in secularism and say that religion should be confined to the private domain, that is not possible, cannot be ensured, cannot be, is impossible to do in the Indian context, restricting religion to the private domain, because religion in India gives meaning to the lives of most people. That's again a powerful argument that Madan is making, and I'd like you to reflect on this and think about it. So Madan is very clear that in countries like India, to impose secularism on religious believers, whatever religion you believe in, is wrong. And he just doesn't say it is wrong. Madan is telling us it's an act of moral arrogance. And if statesmen and political leaders are trying to impose secularism, however noble a project it may be, it is an act of political folly. Madan. So you can make out here that is on a very clearly is telling us that secularism, imposition of secularism in this country was not just an act of moral arrogance, it is tantamount to political folly. That's Madan. Let's take a look at Akil Bilgrami also, when he's interrogating, when looking at secularism. His argument is that secularism, as imposed by the state, stands against the pluralist and tolerant traditions that have existed in India for centuries. Okay, you can make out from the way in which I'm summarizing the major argument that they're all telling us something very profound that perhaps we have not quite grasped because we may not be familiar with the writings and so on. So there's need for us to look at statements made in this case by Akil Bilgrami that when the state says, when you inscribe secular, for example, into the preamble of the Constitution, when you say that India is basically a secular state or should be a secular state, there must be a clear separation of religion from the state and so on. Are we doing the right thing? Did we do the right thing? And are we trying to do, in reinforcing that, are we doing the right thing? So Bilgrami is very clear that this kind of state-sponsored or state-imposed secularism stands against pluralist traditions that have existed in India for centuries, stands against the tolerant traditions that have existed in India for centuries. So the concept of negotiated secularism is important here because it says when you're trying to do something which doesn't quite fit into the culture, the pluralist tolerant culture of this country, well, you need to perhaps prefix another term before secularism, and the term that Bilgrami prefixes is called negotiated secularism. There is need for a model of negotiated secularism. Very interesting concept. I'll explain a little more in the next slide. What does Bilgrami mean by negotiated secularism? Bilgrami is actually telling us that instead of, scholars like great leaders like Nehru, Gandhi, and others, saying that we must be secular, we must do this, we must do that, and so on. In a way, it is like imposing, however noble it may be, the project of secularism from above. This Bilgrami is very clear should not happen. Instead of being imposed from above, this kind of secularism should actually emerge from below. It should emerge from the bottom up. And while you're devising this concept of secularism, negotiated secularism, you got to incorporate into that concept moderate political voices and assumptions of different religious communities. Now, one may argue here that whatever Gandhi and Nehru did was not something that they imposed from above. It actually reflected these moderate political voices and the assumptions of religious communities and so on. But I'm not getting into that debate right now. We could discuss this a little later. That Nehru and Gandhi did not impose, it actually came from below and so on. But nonetheless, there's a point that Bilgrami is making here, which I want you to appreciate, to the question that Bilgrami poses, was the kind of secularism that entered into a constitution negotiated secularism or not? I think we would have to be a little careful in answering the question because Bilgrami is very clear that it was not negotiated secularism, that was imposed secularism. I'm moving across to Bhikkhu Parekh and then finally to to the last caller. Bhikkhu Parekh is equally critical of the kind of secularism that entered our country post-independence. Nehruvian secularism, he says, is idealistic. Bhikkhu Parekh is saying this, unrealistic, and influenced terribly by alien Western concepts. And we went into this a little while ago. We said secularism itself is a Western concept. It emerged out of the Reformation, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and so on, the Protestant ethic, and so on. Okay, so to be influenced by that and to think that that would work in India is idealistic, unrealistic, and so on. Because this kind of secularism very clearly, as we discussed this earlier, pushes religion into the private sphere. We went into what Nehru said here. Keep religion in your homes, practice religion in your homes, don't bring it into the public. When this kind of secularism tries to push religion into the private sphere, obviously you'll have a lot of resentment. And the argument of Bhikkhu Parekh, this cannot be done in the case of Indian religion, Indian religions, perhaps. And therefore, you have the resurgence of religion in aggressive forms. This is Bhikkhu Parekh's thesis, which I think also deserves merit in this context. And my last scholar is Amartya Sen, when in his Secularism and his Discontents, he says, he refers to 6 leading critiques of secularism. The first, the non-existence critique. The idea of secularism as a church-state separation does not exist in India. There's no binary here, as we saw it in the case of another scholar earlier. So there are critics who are saying that this kind of secularism that has been imported into India, how relevant is it in the Indian context? So this critique is called the non-existence critique. The second critique is called the favoritism critique, where a lot of scholars today, not of more than scholar, I think it's the rank and file of a particular religion today, which is saying that your brand of secularism is appeasing the minorities by giving special provisions or doing whatever the state is doing. This is minority appeasement, and these people don't hesitate in branding secularists as pseudo-secularists, and branding and even using the term secularist. In some writings, you may have come across this term called secular. You guys are sick because you believe in appeasement, you believe in placation of the minority, special provisions. No, they don't deserve that, because this is clearly one kind of rashtra. This is clearly meant for the majority community, and so on and so forth. So this favoritism critique is the second of Amartya Sen's critiques. The third is the prior identity critique, which extols the supremacy of religious identity over national identity in the Indian ethos. So did we have a national identity earlier? Obviously, we did not. What was the identity that prevailed over India in the earlier periods and earlier ages? It was religious identity, and therefore that is something that Amartya Sen refers to as the prior identity critique, where the supremacy of religious identity over national identity in Indian ethos is privileged. And the fourth is the Muslim sectarian critique, which points out frequently, this happens very frequently, especially nowadays, which says that Muslims are sectarian, and because they're sectarian, they don't have this Indian identity. They have a different kind of an identity. It's difficult for us to say what kind of identity the Muslim has, but it's clearly not Indian. It's anti-Indian. Of course, you have very loose expressions like their allegiance is to Pakistan, that is, and so on. But I don't think that expresses this sectarian critique very well. But it's a kind of discomfort that you find in the minds by saying that they don't quite fit in here, they do not belong here, they don't consider themselves Indians because they are secular. That's the fourth of the critiques of Amartya Sen. The fifth is the anti-modernist critique, which refers to arguments that secularism is a modern concept. The secularism goes against the values that traditional societies believed in, and so on. And the last critique of Amartya Sen is the cultural critique, which says very clearly that if you look at, if you're looking at one ism, which is the essence of Indian society, that represents the essence of Indian society, that is Hinduism. You may have a lot of other religions either breaking away from Hinduism or emerging in this part of the world, but they are not. They're not Hinduism. And Amartya Sen even refers to this phrase when critics are saying that all other religions are pretentious. So against the background of these six leading critiques of this kind of secularism that we brought into our country post-independence, and these six critiques are important for us to reflect at this point of time: the non-existence critique, the favoritism critique, the prior identity critique, Muslim sectarian critique, anti-modernist critique, and the cultural critique, all of which are referred to by Amartya Sen in Secularism and its Discontents. He is not obviously going along with these arguments, because he critiques each of the above six arguments. Obviously, Amartya Sen would not be one who would appreciate any of the above six arguments. He critiques each of them rather than the state steering clear of any association with religion. Amartya Sen is telling us here that the state must actually practice basic symmetry of treatment in dealing with different religions and with members of different religious communities. So there's a normative kind of a statement that Amartya Sen is making after looking at these 6 critiques and saying that these critiques don't deserve merit. But then what should the state do? Because these critiques are of Indian secularism are quite rampant, quite vociferous, quite entering the mainstream discourse. Then there's a kind of solution that Amartya Sen is offering here. Okay, at the end of this section, the second section, I'm presenting before you a kind of hypothesis. That when you look at these 5 or 6 scholars, and they're leading scholars, they've written extensively on secularism, and Maxim Dias has gone into their arguments in great depth. When you look at the arguments of the above scholars, these 5 or 6 scholars, and you juxtapose their arguments with the writing on the wall today. And what is the writing on the wall today? Within brackets, I put it very briefly as this. It's much more serious than what I've tried to do here. Spread of communalism, majoritarian religiosity, a spread of Islamophobia are just 3 manifestations of a huge churning that is happening in the Indian society today. That's the writing on the wall. That's the context behind the holding of this particular conference today and many other conferences. Just a couple of weeks ago, we were at St. Joseph's College, Xavier Hall in the postgraduate section, where the Department of Social Work had organized a lovely workshop titled Celebrating Religious Pluralism in India. And the organizers had brought together a whole lot of scholars to reflect on the essence of their respective religions. We had it was a feast for us to be part of that particular workshop celebrating religious pluralism in India. Okay, so when events like these, and following, let me also quickly tell you that following this very successful workshop, which was held in Xavier Hall in the PG section of St. Joseph's College, the organizers, prepared a report. The morning sessions were devoted to presentations by leading exponents of different religions. The afternoon sessions were devoted to workshops where youngsters like you came together and said, this is how we would like to address the problems of the day and so on. So all of this was compiled into a report and given to the principal of St. Joseph's College. And the principal and the rector immediately replied. Some of us, of course, said this is good, this needs to be taken forward and so on. So the rector of St. Joseph's College and the principal of St. Joseph's College clearly said that these are the values that the Jesuit Society believes in. These are the values that we'd like to impart to students of Jesuit institutions, and therefore these things should be taken forward. Okay, so against what has been said by these 5-6 scholars, who are saying that somehow we are not happy with the kind of secularism which has been imported into this country. Why is secularism under threat today? Why do we see this huge uprising to not uprising? Why do we see this huge churning today? Why do we see the nasty things happening around us? Why is this majoritarian religiosity spreading like a cancer throughout the length and breadth of the country, and so on and so forth? So when you juxtapose the writing on the wall today with the critique of Indian secularism as expressed by the 5 or 6 scholars, I think one has to ask this particular question: have we entered the post-secular age? Okay, so my hypothesis behind my entire paper, entire presentation is this, again, influenced by what these 5 or 6 scholars have said, is that perhaps this secularism project in India has failed. Perhaps. You're welcome to disagree with me, but based upon this hypothesis, that secularism in India has failed, and I've given you the evidence from, or the arguments expressed by 5 or 6 leading scholars, writers on secularism in India. The argument here that I'm making is that we have perhaps entered the post-secular age. we are in the post-secular age. What do I mean by the post-secular age? Let me quickly point this out to you. Post-secularism points to a clear breakdown of the secularization thesis. That's the hypothesis that I'm making in my paper, especially the third part of my, the third division of my paper. Post-secularism points to a clear breakdown of the secularization thesis. How does one justify a statement of this particular kind? Well, there are 2 or 3 arguments here before you. That in a secular state, the optimism was that in a secular state, religion would gradually lose its authority. There must be an S here. I've forgotten to add an S here. Would gradually lose its authority over the public sphere and withdraw into the private sphere. This has not happened, and therefore there's a breakdown of the secularization thesis or project. Point number 2, it is clear that in India today, religion will continue to remain an influential force in society. There is no writing away religion. Look at what is happening around us. I don't have to go into details. Look at what is happening. Can religion, as the secularism project prophesied, would be relegated slowly and steadily into the background, into our homes. We will not bring it out into open. That has not happened. In fact, religion is now in our faces. Right in our faces. Every day the headlines are about putting religion in the forefront, in the headlines, doing something. So this cannot be done. So the secularization project, obviously, to me, has failed, because secularization itself says that there would be withdrawal of religion and so on and so forth. So my third point here, it's also clear that religion would continue to challenge the legitimacy of the constitutional democratic state, and its values is also very clearly visible before us. Because when the adherents of the majoritarian religion are very clearly telling us that religion supersedes the state, religion preceded the state, religion, when you have something that religion is religious dogmas contesting the constitutional democratic state, the values of the state, their preference is very clearly for the preeminence given to religion. So when we see religion challenging the legitimacy of even the constitutional democratic state and the values that it believed in, again, I'm resting my case here. I think there's a clear breakdown of the secularization thesis. So this brings me to my last couple of slides, my young friends. I thought I shouldn't just leave you with a pessimistic note by telling you that we have entered the post-secular age, that religion is bound to keep doing things that we may not like, but then this is the age of the revival of religion, and so on and so forth. Do we sit quiet and take things as they come, see the things that are happening around us, or do we need to do something? We are talking in an educational institution, we're talking in a Jesuit institution, we're talking, I think we're all, those of us who have gathered here, are basically of a secular mindset. Okay, so if the India today cannot be described as the secular India of its makers, of the founders of our constitution, of our great leaders, if we have entered the era of post-secularism, then it's very important that in a conference like this, we discuss the role of religion in post-secular India. Okay, so I've brought in this argument into this conference that we have entered the post-secular age in India, and therefore I am saying here that we need to have 5 commitments if religion is here to stay, and if we are to ensure that religion does not do the kind of things it's doing today. There are 5 important commitments that all of us, that citizens of this country, have to affirm. Commitment number 1, a commitment to reinforcing the essence of every religion, whichever religious background we come from, whichever religion we may be adherents of. It's important that we accept this Gandhian argument that at the common core, every religion believes in peace, justice, compassion, humanism, caring and sharing, living in harmony, and so many others. All right. Now, this is commitment number 1 that we have to make in post-secular India. Second commitment, a commitment to the law of the land. to constitutional values, to democracy, to rule of law. That again cannot be lost sight of. Commitment number 3, to a pluralistic dialogue among adherents of different religious denominations and culture. This is important. It is happening in a very slow way, but I think it's important that we hasten this. The workshop at Xavier Hall a couple of weeks ago was an attempt at doing this. There are NGOs, there are people who are trying to do this. I think we need to strengthen their hands. A commitment to pluralistic dialogue among different religious communities. Number 4, a commitment to social engagement, to be actively engaged in promoting humane social transformation. The society around us, and the pandemic brought this out beautifully, that there's, when things are not going too well, and when large sections of the people are struggling, are suffering, are engaged in day-to-day livelihood matters, do we fight over religion, or do we express a commitment to a religion embarking upon social engagement where promoting humane social transformation becomes important? And the 5th, the last commitment, is a commitment to emancipatory spirituality, which is, of course, may not be easy for young people in this audience this morning. But this is also very important, because when we express a commitment to emancipatory spirituality, what we're talking about is the ability in each one of us to rise above the things that we think are very important today, materialism, existentialism, and so on. So can we rise above that? Can we look for answers to the purpose of human existence? Can we strive to move on from crass religiosity to elevating spirituality? Now, this is the kind of commitment that I think are needed to be taken seriously by each one of us in a post-secular India. If you go along with my argument that the religion is here to stay, secularism project has not quite succeeded, that we are in a post-secular age in India. Well, these 5 commitments, I think we need to take. And this is my last slide. The idea that religion should be socially engaged. And what do we mean by socially engaged religion? That religion should be actively engaged in promoting and shaping positive and humane social transformation. This, I think, is the need of the hour. I've spoken enough. I thought I had to finish earlier, but then I had some important points to share with you. I'm through. Thank you very much. And I'm now open for queries, questions, whatever. Let me just get
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sure, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Sir has taken us through the articulation of the idea of secularism through Gandhi and Nehru, the challenges to Indian secularism today, and religion in post-secular India. As he said, the floor is open for questions. There are already some questions, sir. Shall I read them out for you?
No, don't worry. May I have your name? What's your name?
Marianne.
Marianne. Just a minute. I'm looking at those questions, so don't
yes, sure, sir.
take the trouble.
Sure,
I look at Mohammed. Take Mohammed's question first. Is it possible to rethink secularism in the Indian context to annihilate the menace of communalism, and how? Okay, Mohammed, that's a deep question you have posed. My essential thesis. Now, what you're saying, in a way, takes us back to that very nice project that we associate with Gandhi, Nehru, and a whole lot of others. So your argument tells me, perhaps we got to go back to that ideal scenario, that ideal secularism that we thought would take root in India. So therefore, your question, can we rethink that kind of secularism in the Indian context, and would that annihilate the menace of communalism? And then your second question, how could that be done? Mohammed, what I'm saying is essentially that project has failed. And I'm not saying it myself. There are a whole lot of scholars, and at least 6 of them I've quoted here, great minds who have done a lot of work on secularism, who are telling us that I don't want to go into repeat those reasons, but their argument I'm picking up here in my paper and saying that noble secularist project seems to have let us down very badly. We thought, Nehru thought, Gandhi thought, a lot of people thought that we would be able to relegate religion to the private sphere, that we would be able to secularize Indian society and be able to move forward in a task of nation. That has not happened. And therefore, Mohammed, to go back to that same secularist project, to think that will annihilate communalism, no, that's not what I'm trying to say. Okay, I'd like you to go through my slides. I'll share my paper also with you later. I was telling Mahesh, please bring out all these papers as a volume. So what I'm trying to tell you, Mohammed, and the others, is that that to me, I'm quoting from the scholars, it appears that this project has failed, and therefore to go back to project and think that is going to take care of the communalism that we're seeing today will not happen. We have to have a different kind of a project. So if we acknowledge the fact that we're now in a post-secular age, we have to devise a new methodology, we have to devise a new language, we have to devise perhaps a newism to deal with the kind of communalism that is now before us today. Okay, that much for Mohammed Mazharuddin's question. Thank you, Mohammed, for that perceptive question, but we'll have to go back to the drawing board, I think, and reflect on this. I'll then take up Marianne Nidhi Katti's question. Our Indian households as well as universities are not preaching secularism in general practice. When youths are trying to follow secularism, families and parents are not making them to do so. How to establish secularism practically in Indian society, especially in, again, a nice question, especially in youth's minds when political parties are in use for. Okay, Nidhi, thank you again. Very perceptive question. These are all students, I presume, Marianne? Mohammed, Nidhi?
Most of them are students, yes.
Okay,
sir.
okay, Nidhi, thank you. I can see where you're coming from when you're posing this question. Okay, and we have discussed this in other forums also. When we look at the spread of communalism in society, and we know that these are politicians who are doing it. Politicians are spreading the canker of communalism in us. We are, used to be at peace with each other. We used to live in harmony. Communal harmony used to be practiced for centuries and so on and so forth. Now, we have a few of these forces. They're gaining ascendancy, of course, spreading the communal canker and creating all kinds of problems. So as youth, when you go back to your homes and discuss it with your parents, I hope not with your teachers, but with parents, you realize that the parents' minds are also communalized. And if you are trying to, I remember my daughter coming home and asking my wife, who is a Muslim, what is Islam, and so on. When the earliest, what shall I say, roots of, this kind of a difference, they are different from us, not just difference, they are, there's no fraternity between us and them. They come from a completely different culture. They need to be stigmatized. They need to be branded and so on and so forth. When this kind of language comes from our own parents, what is a young person like Nidhi going to do when she finds that the parents' minds themselves are communalized for a particular religion, against another religion? This becomes very problematic, and I appreciate the concern of Nidhi. How do we bring about the kind of secularism that Gandhi and Nehru spoke about when our households, and Nidhi also says our universities seem to be afflicted by this kind of a feeling. Okay, so the need of the hour, and this is where I think conferences and workshops are very important. The need of the hour is for you young people to, I'll give you Gandhi's example again, go through Gandhi's autobiography. Nidhi, if you give me your address, I will send you an email, I'll send you a soft copy of Mahatma Gandhi's autobiography. Go through the first section of the autobiography where he has taken the trouble to go through his early upbringing and his stay in England and in South Africa. He has devoted a lot of time to reading the scriptures, particularly in the original. Okay, he's also read secondary sources, but he has read them. Okay, point number one, that each one of you must imbibe the essence of all. Can we imbibe the essence of all these religions in our understanding, in our practice, in our relations with people from other religions? This, I think, is very important for us to do. So Nidhi, give me your email and I'll send you a copy first of Gandhi's autobiography. And if you are in touch with me, I'll also give you other documents which will tell us exactly what we need to do in order to combat this canker of communalism. Okay, Nidhi is a PhD research scholar. Okay, thank you, Belgavi. Okay, nice. Nidhi, be in touch with me, and I will be able to share some more details with you. Mohammed is not convinced with my answer. He says secularism projects failed. Mohammed, go through my slides once again. Go through what these 5 or 6 scholars are telling us about secularism, how you can't quite transplant that. It should be indigenous, so on. So if you're saying alternative, I think in a post-secular age, we need to look at alternatives. So, Mohammed, perhaps a workshop, perhaps some thinking from your side, perhaps you can engage in some exercise in figuring it out what kind of secularism do we need to bring into our country to be able to address the evil of communalism. Okay, Nidhi, thank you for the email. I request the organizers to share it with me. Somebody else without a name is saying, register number is put there, is minority appeasement Sindhu? Is it Sindhu? Okay. Is minority appeasement inherently a deterrent to secularism, especially with the majorities arguing the minority group movement consonants? Sindhu, if that's your name, again, a good question, deep question. I'm not sure whether I have the answers to your question, but when we brought in the concept of minority appeasement with the majority adherents, majoritarian religions are telling us, not only in India but in other parts of the world also, would it be a deterrent to secularism? I don't think so. I don't think so. In fact, I believe in a concept, Western of course, but I think which could be eminently suited to India also. When one looks at the kind of variants of democracy and what kind of democracy would suit countries like India, I am bringing in electoral politics into this discussion here by saying that if one believes in a kind of democracy called cosmopolitan democracy, or if one believes in a kind of democracy that is that gives space for all minorities to be represented fairly equally. We have a proportional system of representation. We have a term used by a Norwegian scholar called consociational democracy. There are rich terms that one can explore, which would perhaps not be labeled as minority appeasement, but would be labeled as bringing equity into the democratic and the electoral discourse, because it's when you are alienating minorities, when you're treating minorities as the other, when you're labeling them, when you're putting them on a weak wicket, and when you're persecuting them, they are obviously not going to be happy with that. When that scenario is unfolding before us, how do we come up with ways and means by projects which will ensure that they're not marginalized, that they're not persecuted, that they're told that they have a place? And one way would be to explore this rich concept of consociational democracy, but that would be the term, the theme for another discussion perhaps. So Marianne, I've taken all the questions in the chat box.
Yes, sir.
Do we stop here?
Yes, sir. I think we've taken up more than was planned previously of your time. So thank you so much, sir. There's one more question in case you want to answer,
okay,
sir, in the chat.
Okay, give me.
1 second, sir. This is secularism is a series of principles intended for the guidance of those who find theology indefinite or inadequate. This is or deem it unreliable. It replaces theology. This is an excerpt of the characteristics of secularism from the principles of secularism. This is a valid point of why secularism failed in India, as theology is fundamental in every religion, either major or minor. Your comments on this, sir?
Okay, now this is a very profound statement. I'm happy that the gentleman here has joined us and said so. I have no disagreement with what he has stated here. Definitely it is true, and he has quoted from some very good text here. He also is making the observation that that when theology seems indefinite, or theology seems inadequate, unreliable, and so on, secularism the wherewithal to be able to replace even theology. Okay, so Holyoake, who was obviously one of the gurus of secularism in the West. In fact, the earliest reference to secularism comes from Holyoake's works. He's referred to this work, Principles of Secularism. Now, so taking this as a given, the first part of the observation that Achyutananda has made, I would also take it as a valid point. So if we take this as a valid point, or as the answer to the question why secularism has failed in India, well, do we look at theology, which is fundamental in every religion? Do we instead move on to looking at theology, moving away from secularism and moving to theology? If I got the question right, this is what he's telling us. Since a new project of theology, where we look at something much more than what religion has been telling us all these days, perhaps we'll be able to find the answer to the question that we're looking for answers to the question we're looking for in this particular conference. So there may be a deviation from what he has stated, the Achyutananda has stated here, but my take on this would be as follows, and proceeding from my hypothesis that the religion is here to stay. Secularism project seems to have failed, and therefore in the post-secular age, what is it that we need to do? Do we need to take those 5 commitments seriously that I've said here and left it open there? I think we need to add what scholars like Achyutananda are telling us. Perhaps we need to bring theology into the framework of a discussion to find out whether theology would give us answers to the questions that we are looking for. That would be my take on the profound observation made by Achyutananda. Thank you, sir, for your observation.
Thank you, sir. I think we all learned a lot and we have a lot to reflect on. Like you said, you've left many things open-ended, which gives us the chance to reflect on this post the session as well. So thank you so much for spending time with us today, sir. I think that brings us to the end of your session. If it's okay, sir, maybe we can share your contact details, your email address or something, because some people are still asking questions, etc. So maybe if they want to get in touch with you, would that be okay?
Please do that. Please do that.
Sure, sir. Sure. So thank you so much, sir.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Thank you, sir. Yeah. So that brings us to the end of our first lecture. Our next lecture by Dr. Shashidhar will begin at 12:15. So we have a 15-minute break. I request participants to join again at 12:15 and we'll begin with the next lecture. Thank you, everyone.
Good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. Our second session will be facilitated by Dr. M. Shashidhar. He is a professor of history at Bangalore University. He specializes in Indian social history, Ambedkar, and Dalit studies. He has over 24 years of teaching experience and has presented and published a number of papers, both nationally and internationally. On behalf of the management and organizers, I welcome you, sir. And thank you for accepting our invitation to address us. Before I hand it over to sir, I would like to request the participants to share their questions and comments in the chat. They will be shared with the speaker at the end of the lecture. Thank you. Over to you, sir. Sir will be addressing us on democracy and the inherent contradictions.
Yes. Good afternoon. Is it audible?
Yes, sir. You are audible, sir.
Yeah.
You are very much audible. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Shall I start up?
Yes, sir. You can go ahead.
Yeah.
The presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. As I've suggested, I would be just trying to get into some of the questions that are before us in understanding the challenges to secularism. And I would be prodding on the issue of democracy and the inherent contradiction. Before that, before delving into these issues, we need to actually understand or define secularism. So secularism, you see, has been understood in the context of Europe. In the European context, it always meant that it was to do with the thinking away from the church. However, secularism, the understanding of it, the theorizing of it, dates back to the 19th century from the French scholar Jean Baubert. He sees secularism as three vital aspects wherein it speaks about the separation of religious institutions from the institutions of the state. ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಧಾರ್ಮಿಕ ಸಂಸ್ಥೆಗಳು ಮತ್ತು ರಾಜ್ಯಾಡಳಿತ ಇವೆರಡಕ್ಕೂ ವ್ಯತ್ಯಾಸವಿದೆ ಅನ್ನುವಂತಹದ್ದನ್ನ, ಇವೆರಡಕ್ಕೂ ಒಂದಾಗಿ ನೋಡುವಂತ ಅಗತ್ಯ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅನ್ನುವಂತ ಒಂದು ಅಂಶವನ್ನ ನಾವು ನೋಡ್ತೇವೆ. ಹಾಗೇನೇನೆ ಅದರ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ನಾವು ಎರಡನೆಯ ಭಾಗವಾಗಿ ಫ್ರೀಡಮ್ ಆಫ್ ಕಾನ್ಸೈನ್ಸ್ ಫಾರ್ ಆಲ್ ಇಂಡಿವಿಜುವಲ್ಸ್ ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದು, ವಿತ್ ರಿಸ್ಟ್ರಿಕ್ಷನ್ಸ್ ಓನ್ಲಿ ಟು ದಿ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಟೆಂಟ್ ಅಂಡ್ ನೀಡ್ ಆಫ್ ಪಬ್ಲಿಕ್ ಆರ್ಡರ್. ಎಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ನಾವು ಯೋಚಿಸುವಂತ, ನಾವು ಭಾವಿಸುವಂತ ವಿಚಾರಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಸ್ವಾತಂತ್ರ್ಯವಿದೆ ಅನ್ನುವಂತ ಅಂಶವನ್ನ ನಾವು ಇಲ್ಲಿ ನೋಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಸಾಧ್ಯ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. And all those institutions attached to religion, and those of the institutions that do not have those of the institutions which are attached to religion, and those of the institutions that are attached to the state ಅನ್ನುವಂತ ಅಂಶಗಳು ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಕಾಣಿಸುತ್ತೆ. Hello, is it audible?
Yes,
Hello,
sir, you're
is it
audible,
audible?
sir. You're audible. So go ahead, sir. Go ahead, sir. We have been
Thank
listening
you,
to you.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you. It also speaks about respecting the rights of the other individuals ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ರ ಇದರಲ್ಲಿ ಕಾಣಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಸಾಧ್ಯ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. We are not only talking about the conscience for all individuals, freedom of conscience for all individuals. It is also about respecting the right of other individuals. The third aspect that we are looking from the point of view of the French scholar is that there shall be no discrimination by the state on the basis of beliefs. This also indicates that the state shall not discriminate one individual from the other. ಒಬ್ಬರಿಂದ ಮತ್ತೊಬ್ಬರನ್ನ ತಮ್ಮ ನಂಬಿಕೆಗಳ ಆಧಾರದಲ್ಲಿ ತಾರತಮ್ಯವನ್ನ ಮಾಡುವ ಹಾಗಿಲ್ಲ ಅನ್ನುವಂತ ಈ ಭಾವನೆಯನ್ನ ಈ ಡೆಫಿನೇಷನ್ಗಳು ವ್ಯಕ್ತಪಡಿಸುತ್ತೆ. ಸೊ ಫ್ರಮ್ ದಿ ಯುರೋಪಿಯನ್ ಕಾಂಟೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಇದೆಲ್ಲವೂ ಕೂಡ ಚರ್ಚ್ ಮತ್ತು ಸ್ಟೇಟ್ ನ ಹಿನ್ನೆಲೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾತಾಡುವಂತದನ್ನ ನಾವು ನೋಡ್ತೀವಿ. See, at the same time, when we are talking in the American context, Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers of the American Constitution, you see, was removed from the state's high school curriculum. ಸಂವಿಧಾನ ರಚನೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಬಹಳ ಮಹತ್ತರವಾದಂತ ಭೂಮಿಕೆಯನ್ನ ವಹಿಸಿಕೊಂಡಂತ ಒಬ್ಬ ಮನುಷ್ಯ ಥಾಮಸ್ ಜಾಫರ್ಸನ್. ಅವರನ್ನ ಶಾಲಾ ಪಠ್ಯಪುಸ್ತಕದಿಂದ ಅವರ ಹೆಸರನ್ನ ತೆಗೆದುಬಿಡ್ತಾರೆ. See, that is the reason as to why his name was removed from the high school curriculum was for his sin in the eyes of the Texians for the phrase that he used. And the phrase was a wall of separation between the church and the state. ಧರ್ಮ ಅಥವಾ ಧಾರ್ಮಿಕ ಸಂಸ್ಥೆ ಮತ್ತು ರಾಜ್ಯ ವ್ಯವಸ್ಥೆ ಇವೆರಡರ ನಡುವೆ ಒಂದು ಅಂತರ ಇರಬೇಕು ಅನ್ನುವಂತ ವಿಚಾರವಾಗಿ ಆ ವ್ಯತ್ಯಾಸವನ್ನ ಅಥವಾ ಫ್ರೇಜು ಅವ್ರು ಕೊಟ್ಟ ಹಿನ್ನೆಲೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಇದನ್ನ ವಿರೋಧಿಸಿ ಅವರನ್ನ ಒಂದು ರೀತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಬಹಿಷ್ಕರಿಸುವಂತ ವಿಧಾನವನ್ನ ಅಳವಡಿಸಿಕೊಂಡದ್ದನ್ನ ನಾವು ನೋಡ್ತೀವಿ. ಥಾಮಸ್ ಜಾಫರ್ಸನ್, ಜೇಮ್ಸ್ ಮೆಡಿಸನ್, ಫ್ರಾಂಕ್ಲಿನ್ ಮತ್ತು ಇತರರು, ಇಟ್ ಈಸ್ ಬೀನ್ ಸೆಡ್ that they did contribute to the making of United States a secular nation. ಇದನ್ನ ನಾವು ಗಮನಿಸಬೇಕಾಗುತ್ತೆ. ಹೀಗೆ ಹಲವರು ಮಹನೀಯರು ಆ ಕಾಲಮಾನದ ಯೋಚನೆಗಳನ್ನ ಮೀರಿ ದೇಶ ಸಾಗಬೇಕಾದಂತ ದಿಕ್ಕಿಗೆ ದಿಕ್ಸೂಚಿಗಳಾಗಿ ನಿಂತಂತ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿಗಳಾಗಿ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಕಾಣ್ತಾರೆ. In one of the books, Andrew Copson's book on secularism, therefore, Jefferson occupies a more honored place than in the eyes of the Texians. ಇದನ್ನ ನಾವು ಗಮನಿಸಬೇಕಾಗುತ್ತೆ. ಅದು ಒಂದು ಕಾಲಘಟ್ಟದಲ್ಲಿ ಅವರು ಯಾವ ವಿಚಾರಗಳನ್ನ ಮೀರಿ ನಿಂತ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ವಿರೋಧಾಭಾಸಗಳು ವ್ಯಕ್ತವಾದಾಗ್ಯೂ ಕೂಡ ಮುಂದಿನ ತಲೆಮಾರುಗಳು ಅವರನ್ನ ನೆನೆದು ಅವರು ಹಾಕಿಕೊಟ್ಟಂತ ಹಾದಿಯನ್ನ ಗಮನಿಸ್ತಾ ಅವರಿಗೆ ವಿಶೇಷವಾಗಿ ಗೌರವವನ್ನ ಸಲ್ಲಿಸಿರುವಂತ ಒಂದು ಯೋಚನೆಗಳು ನಮ್ಗೆ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಕಂಡು ಬರ್ತದೆ. Now, when we are in this sense, when we are talking in the context of India, then how we define secularism? ನಾವು ಈ ಧರ್ಮಾತೀತತೆಯನ್ನ ಅಥವಾ ಧರ್ಮ ನಿರಪೇಕ್ಷವಾದವನ್ನ ಹೇಗೆ ನಾವು ನೋಡ್ಬೇಕು ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದನ್ನ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಕಾಣ್ಬೇಕಾಗುತ್ತೆ. ನಮ್ಮ ದೇಶದ ಸನ್ನಿವೇಶದಲ್ಲಿ we are a democracy, and democracy, what does it mean? It means the rule of the people. It means also suggesting of the rule of the majority. That means there is a majority and there are minority in it ಅನ್ನುವಂತ ಸೂಚನೆಯನ್ನ ಕೊಡುತ್ತೆ. So therefore, in the post-independent period, for the first time after independence, we tried to settle many issues, and those inherent contradictions were settled through our Constitution of India. The Constitution and the Constitution makers of the Constitution played a vital role in redressing many of these contradictions and bringing them in a better way, so as to accommodate all the community of people, those that were living in the frontiers of India, or within India. So when we are looking from this point of view, what does rule of majority mean? What does minority mean is the context. If we were to think of what Ambedkar had long talked about, it is the responsibility of the majority to look after the minority ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದನ್ನ ಒಂದ್ ಕಡೆ ಹೇಳುವಂಥದ್ದಿದೆ. The minority should be taken into context. It does not mean that an exceptional vantage point is given to the minority. ಆ ತರ ಅಲ್ಲ ಅದು. ಆದ್ರೆ ಅವರನ್ನು ಪರಿಗಣನೆಗೆ ತೆಗೆದುಕೊಂಡು ಯೋಚಿಸುವಂತ ವಿಚಾರ ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದನ್ನ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ನೋಡ್ಬೇಕಾಗುತ್ತೆ. Then ಆದ್ರೆ when we are talking about secularism, we see that in what is happening to our history, culture, and research. From that point of view of history, we see that a theory that Aryan migration is a myth is seen today. If that is the history that we are going to talk about, what would happen to it talks about all India origin of these people, inhabitants, who are they? And if they are all related to one another, the contradiction that exists is, then why there is this kind of a discrimination? Then why the system of caste should continue ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದು ನಮ್ಮ ಮುಂದೆ ನಿಂತ್ಕೊಳ್ಳುವಂತ ವಿಚಾರವಾಗುತ್ತೆ. ಆರ್ಯನ್ ಮೈಗ್ರೇಷನ್ ಥಿಯರಿಯನ್ನ ನಾವು ಮಾತಾಡುವಂತ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಆರ್ಯನ್ ಮೈಗ್ರೇಷನ್ ಥಿಯರಿ ಇವತ್ತು ಮೈಗ್ರೇಷನ್ ಮಿತ್ ಅದೊಂದು ಮಿಥ್ಯ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳುವಂತ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ, ಹಾಗಾದ್ರೆ ಅದರ ಅರ್ಥಗಳೇನು ಅಂತ ನಾವು ವಿಶ್ಲೇಷಣೆಯನ್ನ ಮಾಡಿದಾಗ ಅದರ ಅರ್ಥ ಬಹಳ ಸರಳ. ಅದು ಹೊರಗಿನಿಂದ ಯಾರು ಕೂಡ ಬಂದಿಲ್ಲ, ಎಲ್ಲರೂ ಭಾರತೀಯದ ಮೂಲದವರೇ, ಎಲ್ಲರೂ ಇಲ್ಲಿಯವರೇ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳುವಾಗ ನಾವೆಲ್ಲ ಒಂದು ಅನ್ನುವಂತ ಒಂದು ವಿಚಾರವನ್ನ ಹೇಳುತ್ತೆ. ವಿ ಆರ್ ಆಲ್ ಒನ್ ಅಂಡ್ ದ ಸೇಮ್, ವಿ ಆರ್ ಆಲ್ ಒನ್ ಅಂಡ್ ವಿ ಆರ್ ಆಲ್ ಇಂಡಿಯನ್ಸ್ ಅನ್ನುವಂತ ಸ್ಪಷ್ಟ ಅಭಿಮತವನ್ನ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ನೋಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಸಾಧ್ಯ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. ಬಟ್ ದೆನ್ ಇಫ್ ದಟ್ ಈಸ್ ದ ಕೇಸ್, then why discrimination should exist? Why there should be differentiation from the point of view of caste communities ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದು ನಾವು ಇಲ್ಲಿ ನೋಡ್ಬೇಕಾಗುತ್ತೆ. Then if we then it also means that we have to forego the identities of communities and caste, at least in the near future ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದು ನಾವು ಈ ತರ ದೃಷ್ಟಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ನೋಡುವಾಗ ಒಂದೇ, we are talking about one democratic leverage, one democratic process, the majority rule ಅಂತ ಮಾತಾಡುವಾಗ, then we have to think giving up all these community and distinct identities ಅಂತ ನಾವು ಮಾತಾಡಬೇಕಾಗತ್ತೆ, and only think from the perspective of one religion. So if we were to think from the perspective of one religion, then what about the communal divide? How do we answer the multiculturalism in the sense of language, food and dress? ನಾವು ಹಾಗಾದ್ರೆ ಏಕಾಕೃತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಹೇಗೆ ಈ ಬಹುಮುಖಿ ಸಂಸ್ಕೃತಿಯನ್ನ, ಭಾಷೆಯನ್ನ, ಆಹಾರ ಪದ್ಧತಿಯನ್ನ, ಉಡುಪನ್ನ, ನಮ್ಮ ವಿಚಾರಗಳನ್ನ ಹೇಗೆ ನೋಡಬೇಕಾಗುತ್ತೆ ಅನ್ನೋದನ್ನ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ಗಮನಿಸುವಂತದ್ದು ಅತ್ಯಮೂಲ್ಯ. Discussions on secularism is a result of the basic premise that in a democracy the majority shall rule. Then what would happen in the context if we were talking about this in the context of languages? ಒಂದೇ ಭಾಷೆ ಎಲ್ಲ ಅನ್ವಯಿಸ್ಬೇಕು ಎಲ್ಲ ಕಡೆ ಅನ್ನೋದಾದ್ರೆ ಭಾಷೆಗಳ ಪರಿಸ್ಥಿತಿ ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ, ನಮ್ಮ ಯೋಚನೆಗಳು, ಸಮುದಾಯಗಳು ಏನಾಗ್ತವೆ? Languages, do they lose their identity or do they coexist ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದೆಲ್ಲವೂ ನಮ್ಮ ಮುಂದೆ ನಿಂತ್ಕೊಳ್ಳುವಂತ ವಿಚಾರವಾಗುತ್ತೆ. If a language disappears, it is the disappearance of the entire culture and civilization ಅನ್ನೋದನ್ನ ನಾವು ಮರೆಯುವ ಹಾಗಿಲ್ಲ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಒಂದು ಭಾಷೆ ಮರೆಯಾಗುತ್ತೆ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಅದು ಒಂದು ಸಮುದಾಯ, ಸಂಸ್ಕೃತಿ ಮತ್ತು ಒಂದು ಇಡೀ ನಾಗರಿಕತೆಯ ಒಂದು ಮರೆಯನ್ನ ನಾವು ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಕಾಣ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಸಾಧ್ಯ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ ಅನ್ನೋದನ್ನ ನಾವು ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಗಮನಿಸಬೇಕಾಗುತ್ತೆ. ಸೊ ಆಲ್ ದೀಸ್ in understanding the challenges to secularism. Do we recognize the various castes, the fabric of the country? ನಾವು ಅದನ್ನ ಹಾಗೆ ನೋಡ್ತೀವ ಅಥವಾ ನಮ್ಮ ಸಂವಿಧಾನ ನಮಗಿರುವಂತ ಒನ್ ಸಿಟಿಸನ್ಶಿಪ್ ದಟ್ ವಿ ಆರ್ ಆಲ್ ಇಂಡಿಯನ್ಸ್ ಅಂತ ನೋಡ್ತೀವ ಅಂತದ್ದು ನಮ್ಮ ಮುಂದೆ ನಿಂತ್ಕೊಳ್ಳುವಂತ ಯಕ್ಷ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಯಾಗುತ್ತೆ. These are the questions that we have to answer. We are posing some of these issues when we are addressing some of these issues ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದು ನಮ್ಮ ಮುಂದೆ ನಿಂತ್ಕೊಳ್ಳುವಂತ ಅಂಶಗಳಾಗ್ತವೆ. So therefore, so many inherent contradictions when we are talking about secularism. Do we forego the ideal of secularism? Does the ideal of secularism suit the need of the time or the necessity on account of the varied and vital diversity of various castes and tribes, fabric of this country ಅನ್ನುವಂಥದ್ದು ನಮ್ಮ ಮುಂದೆ ನಿಂತ್ಕೊಳ್ಳುವಂತ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. So therefore, we have to answer this along with another important question. Does secularism connect with rationalism and scientific temper? ನಾವು ಸೆಕ್ಯುಲಾರಿಸಮ್ ಅಂತ ಬಳಕೆ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಂಗೆನೆ ಅದರ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಧಾರ್ಮಿಕ ಅಭಿವ್ಯಕ್ತಿತ್ವ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಕಂಡುಬರುವಂತದ್ದು ಸಹಜವಾಗುತ್ತೆ. So when we are talking about religion, does religion go along with scientific temper, rationalism ಅನ್ನುವಂತ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಗಳನ್ನ ನಾವು ನಮ್ಮ ಮುಂದೆ ಯೋಚಿಸಬೇಕಾದಂತ ಅಗತ್ಯಗಳು ಕಂಡು ಬರ್ತವೆ. ಸೊ ನಾವು ವಿಜ್ಞಾನ ಮತ್ತು ಧರ್ಮದ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಹೊಂದಾಣಿಕೆ ಆಗುತ್ತಾ ಅಥವಾ ವಿಜ್ಞಾನವೇ ಬೇರೆ ಧರ್ಮ ಅದಕ್ಕೂ ಇದಕ್ಕೂ ಯೋಚನೆಗಳು ಬರಲ್ಲ, ಅಥವಾ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಮಾಡುವಂತ ಆಯಾಮ ಧರ್ಮಕ್ಕೆ ವಿರುದ್ಧವಾದದ್ದು ಅಂತ ಪರಿಗಣಿಸ್ಬೇಕಾ? ಈ ಎಲ್ಲ ಅಂಶಗಳನ್ನ ನಾವು ಉತ್ತರಿಸುವಂತ ಅಗತ್ಯ ಇದೆ. ಇವೆಲ್ಲವನ್ನ ಹೇಗೆ ನಾವು ಹೊಂದು ತಂದು ನಮ್ಮ ಮುಂದೆ ಇರುವಂತ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆಗಳನ್ನ ಉತ್ತರಿಸುವಂತದ್ದು? How are we to answer these questions that exist before us when we are talking about secularism, or when there is a contradiction to the ideas of secularism that has been enshrined in the Constitution, is the challenge before us. So these are some of the thoughts at this point of time. And I thank St. Joseph's College, my friend Mahesh, for giving me this opportunity to just think over some of these issues that needs to be actually thought about from the education institutions point of view, from the point of view of the new generation, the time of the challenges that are before us. Thank you, Mahesh. Thank you once again for giving me this opportunity to share some of my views on this issue.
Yeah, thank you very much, dear sir. Marianne ma'am, are you around?
Yes, yes. Sir,
Yeah.
shall we answer some questions? Shashidhar sir, can I
Yeah.
read out the questions from the chat, sir?
Professor Marianne, your voice is little low. It's feeble.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can
Yeah.
hear you now.
Okay. Sir, Shashidhar sir, I was asking if I could read the questions from the chat.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure, sir. The first question is from Nidhi Katti. For centuries, we studied Aryans as outsiders and now they are called natives. What if in the future, again, someone comes with another theory and again says they are outsiders? How do we identify the authenticity of the native theory of Aryans? Do you think that these theories related to nativity and non-nativity of Aryans are related to philosophies of ruling parties?
Well, this is a question, that always obviously perturbs the researcher, the historian as well. But however, the writing of history is not so simple as we do answer these questions. History from the bygone days is a polemic. So it is utilized from the point of view of the political ideologies of the time. So therefore, there are various attempts being made from time to time, to give a fashion to the orientation of the ruling political ideologues. However, with bearing these points of view, if we were to look from the perspective of construction of a country, to give a good edifice, to give a good representation, and to bring a well-mannered, constructive idea, then sometimes history could be looked upon in a different manner. However, from the point of view of students, from the point of view of understanding these theories, after all, end as theories itself. No matter how we think, there are always theories that existed. There would come up newer theories, newer orientation, newer facts that would emerge maybe in the future, that will put us to light. And also our hope, the hope of the researcher is to find the fact. So in that eventuality, nothing is final. So these things will continue to exist.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Dheeraj. Increasingly, the state is using religion-friendly legislation to enhance the public role of religious institutions. Is this a good thing?
Again, see, these are issues of arguments, that's all. what I could briefly suggest is that so long as they are constructive in shaping, in building India, in building the nation, maybe they are useful. If it creates a divide, if it creates a tension, then such of the thing will become a nuisance, whether today or in the near future. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, sir. The
Yeah,
next question is from Sudhakar. If we want to
yeah.
get secularism like America, what do we have to do?
Then we have to think from the perspective of what is enshrined in the Constitution. In the Constitution itself, there are a large number of contradictions. For example, we are talking about there shall be no discrimination on the basis of sex, religion, and caste. And again, then we are talking about abolition of caste. So all these are set contradictions. If we were to enshrine something like that, then these contradictions will continue to exist. So we need to talk from the perspective of citizens, that we are all citizens of this nation, and for all of us, this nation is our motherland. From this perspective, all our ideas will stay into the background, and what we need to do for the nation will come to the forefront of all other issues before us. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, sir. Another question from Nidhi. I don't, there is discrimination in the US as well relating to religion. So, how do we understand that in terms of looking at the US as a secular country?
Discriminations continue to exist, and if we were to understand the roots of discrimination, the roots of discrimination always suggest that there is a persistent effort of the dominant to stay dominant. So if we were to talk from the perspective of Dr. Ambedkar, who is one of the founding fathers of the Indian Constitution, who was the foremost of the makers of the Constitution of India, then we have to think otherwise. Because he always spoke the majority rule in the sense of taking into confidence the issues of the minorities. So therefore, these contradictions always exist until we answer why this discrimination, the idea of discrimination, should at all exist. Then there surfaces the issue of domination, and why one needs to dominate is the issue. So those things again are always in conflict and always will exist everywhere.
Thank you, sir. There are some
Thank you.
questions in some of the WhatsApp groups as well. One question is, how do we address casteism, or what is the influence of casteism on secularism?
Yeah, secularism in the European context is always centered around religion. In the Indian context, that is the issue before us. Are we going to restrict it only to the issue of religion, or are we going to delve it between the contradictions of caste communities, of the various cultural patterns that exist in terms of language, in terms of our understanding of things, in the sense of our culture, in the sense of food habits, in the sense of our dressing habits? Do we respect them, or do we think from the perspective of a monolithic system? Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you, sir. One more question. What, according to you, is the most dangerous challenge to secularism? This is from Shrishti.
See, the issue is we need to understand the diversity of this country. The diversity of this country is the greatest challenge before us. We need to accept that, whether we have to respect those diversities, or we're trying to pull it in one way, and which way is that? So Are we going to melt down all these kinds of discriminations that exist, or and bring it into looking from the perspective of one citizenship? Or are we going to allow all these differentiation to exist along respecting them and giving equal opportunity to all despite these differences in the sense of citizenship alone, are the questions that we need to answer today.
Thank you, sir.
Yes.
One more question is, freedom of conscience establishes pluralism, then isn't enforcing secularism on everyone deprivation of that freedom?
Can you repeat it, ma'am?
Freedom of conscience establishes pluralism, then isn't enforcing secularism on everybody deprivation of that freedom?
No, pluralism. That's why, see, you need to understand whether pluralism is in conflict with secularism or pluralism is one and the same as secularism. Pluralism is one and the same as secularism, according to me. If that is the case, then we cannot answer the other. So when we are talking from the sense of not accepting pluralism, then it means that we cannot accept secularism as well. So that is why I had given more prominence in defining secularism in the Indian context. It does not limit itself in the context of religion alone.
Okay, sir.
Yes,
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Prashant Kumar. Don't you think political leaders are mixing religion with politics to gain the votes of the majority?
That has been so from time immemorial. That has been so across all geographical limits across the world. So again, this is a question of identity. What identity one likes to bear along with us. Those. If we were to pose this question, has this identity remained the same from time immemorial, or have the identities changed? Or should we have to look these identities from the newer context or from the context of the old? This is again a challenge before us. Yes.
Thank you, sir. Along the same lines, why is it that politics in the name of God is becoming more prominent today?
No, it's not so. There has always been prominence of God, religion that has existed from quite distant time. So it is also today, because the faith, the idea of faith, always is something which is against rationalism, rational principles, moving away from just belief systems and knowing from actual facts, finding out the realities, understanding the way things function is always from a well predestined ideas of things. So that those contradictions again, happen to continue because these are belief systems. They are not based on any other theories of causation. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, sir. I think this is the last question. Some find it easy to follow secularism in public, but find it challenging in private spheres like our home. How do we address this?
That is because of the inherent contradiction that exists before us. And this contradiction is the pluralism of this country. There is geographic diversity, there is diversity of the inhabitants, the diversity of species that exists. How do you make all this into one is the issue. And if you are able to make this into one, and that is through the constitution, and that is the Constitution of India.
Thank you, sir.
Thank
I
you.
think maybe this is the last question. I apologize. How does the media play a role in promoting peace and harmony, or alternately communalism, within the country?
See, media should be, see, media is not just media per se. It is the representation of the belief system of the people. Again, the question before us is it a learned media that is going before the public, or it is just the belief of ideas that a media is trying to push? These are again, the issue before us. If it is a learned media, then they need to understand the diversity of this country and the way it should be fashioned, the way it should get along. If you are thinking again from the perspective of a monolithic society, then there are many issues that confront us. Whether we are able to do it with force, if it does exist, if it does happen, then what would happen to the culture that we are talking about? The culture that has existed for thousands of years, and that culture is about the culture of the various castes and tribes that have existed in this country. What would happen to them?
Okay, thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you.
There's a follow-up question with relation to your comments on pluralism and secularism.
Yeah.
Pluralism is ambiguous and secularism is a monochromatic system. So how can they be one and the same when one takes away the freedom? Sorry, when it takes away the freedom to follow your religion. Can you kindly elaborate?
See, freedom, secularism means allowing freedom for every one of them. There is no curtailing of freedom for one. There is no exceptions that are made. So therefore, it means the same. Secularism means allowing all, respecting all. So that's where pluralism comes into play. If there is no pluralism, if there is no secularism, then we are talking from a chromatic society or monolithic sort of a society. This is what we're talking about. Yes.
Thank you, sir. I think that brings us to the end of our session. On behalf of the management and organizing committee, I thank you, sir, for spending time with us today. You, much like the previous speaker, have given us a lot to reflect on and a lot to think about. So thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Participants, we'll have a short break. I would request you to join on time so that we can begin the next session on time. The next session will begin at 1:15. Thank you, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to welcome our speaker for the third session, Dr. Ashwath Narayana. Sir is a professor in the Department of History at Bangalore University. His major areas of research include modern history, Kannada literature and history, and aspects relating to culture, society, social protest movements, and the political history of Karnataka. He's written several articles and books relating to these topics. On behalf of the management and organizing committee, sir, we welcome you and thank you for being with us today. Today, sir will be addressing. Thank you, sir. Today, sir will be addressing us on the topic Future of the Past, Text, Context, and Conflicts. Before I hand over to sir, once again, I would like to remind you, if you have any questions or comments relating to the lecture, you can share it in the chat and we'll address it at the end of the session. Thank you, sir. Over to you.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, sir. You are audible, sir. You are audible, sir.
Okay. Oh, that's fine. That's fine. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and I thank the management and Dr. Paul, a good friend of mine, and Mr. Mahesh, faculty in history at St. Joseph's Evening College for for having given me this opportunity to be here with you all to share some of my thoughts on the topic which I would call as future of the past, texts, contexts, and conflicts. Good afternoon, one and all. Today, I'm here to drive through this journey or the textbook journey, particularly in the Indian context, and I'll come down to even Karnataka context. Again, the major issue or the central issue is the issue of secularism, plurality. So these issues are a major concern even in the context of the textbooks. I divide my lecture into 4 parts. One, the pre-colonial period, which I'll be very briefly dealing with, and secondly, the colonial period, and thirdly, the post-independence era. There, I have divided that into 2 parts. One is the national level issues, and fourthly, I'll come down to state of Karnataka. So these are the 4 dots I have. I make an attempt to connect these dots through timeline. I would start my lecture with a quote by T.S. Eliot, one of the celebrated writers of English literary world of the 20th century. In the poem For Quartet, he writes, "Time present and time past are perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in the time past." I just repeat that. Time present and time past are perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in the time past. Which amply demonstrates that history is not something that is, dead. History is not something that is the bygone issue. History is something which is living, which is with us, which is in us. So that is the sense I think we need to understand when we take up the issue of history, because most often when we speak of history, it is taken as if everything is over. We are here only to study those things. No, it's not just that. Studying history or the past is one aspect, but understanding that in our own living existence is something different. So we need to understand that there is history in us, and in that sense, we are only trying to decode our own times, our own living existence. So now, the other important point is the journey of textualization. So textualization, it has several shades, like the creative part of it, the canonizing part of it, and many other forms are there in the textual formation. So basically, when we look at this process of textualization, we need to understand one thing, that any text, whether it's a canonical text or a creative text, is basically the product of an age. Basically, the product of an age. You can't, decontextualize or take out a work or a book from a certain context. We have to situate all these things in the context that they were produced. So in that sense, I would say the texts are basically the byproduct of an age, and they represent the sentiments, the perspectives of an era. Mahesh, is it audible?
Yes, sir. You are audible, sir. We have been listening to you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So these texts represent, reflect a certain perspective of an era. So therefore, we need to place these texts within the context and then try to understand them. And that is the way how we have to look at these texts. So now, in the ancient period, when there were texts like Manodharma Shastra or Kautilya's Arthashastra, Shukraniti Sara, Yagnavalkya, Niti, there were a number of texts. Why these texts were produced? There was a purpose. So what was the purpose? The purpose was decided by the state. So the second point, what I'm trying to come in here is that there is an inherent relationship between the power structure and the text being produced. So without understanding the nature of the power structure, we cannot understand the essence of these texts. So therefore, if someone makes an attempt to understand the relationship between the text being produced and the political power structure and the purpose of the political power structure, the nature of the political structure, power center, then one would understand altogether a different history of humankind. So therefore, the point here is essentially that these texts were in a way, certain ways, the representatives of a certain spirit of the ruling regimes. So in that way, these texts represent certain phase of the authority. So therefore, they are not merely texts. They are the texts representing certain, authority of, a certain period. So in that sense, it's very important to understand why these texts are so, fiercely, fought about when they have to be prescribed for the, students. Particularly, this is happening since the colonial era. I'll come down to that. But earlier to the colonial era, this was the thing. And now I'll come down to another important aspect of the pre-colonial era. That these texts were the the rule books of meant for the rulers. So that way they assumed a greater importance during those times. Now I come down to the colonial period. In the colonial period, very briefly I mentioned that the British particularly were interested in decoding the history of India. And how did they start decoding the history of India? The British tried to decode the history of India by decoding the texts related to or produced in India. So this was a major shift that we see during the colonial period. Now, it is in this background we need to look at the different schools of the knowledge production, or what we call as epistemology. So they were called, or they have been referred to as the Orientalist school, the utilitarians, the Anglicists, etc., etc. So here the two dominant schools, which are very important for us to understand how these productions influenced the future text making. In that sense, the two important schools were, number one, the Orientalist school, and number two, the utilitarian school. So in Orientalist school, particularly during the times of Warren Hastings, a major attempt was made by the certain Orientalists like William Jones, Colebrook, Charles Wilkinson, Alhad, Maxwell, later Maxwell, James Prinsep, etc., who tried to understand the corpus of literature, particular Sanskrit literature, and they tried to translate these things from Sanskrit to Persian to English. So there is a different level of politics being employed there. Anyway, now the important point is that the Orientalists were able to understand India's past. They were trying to recreate an image of India through their research. So the essential point here is that the British understood India from their experiences. They were outsiders. They were not insiders. So whatever that was produced by the Orientalists, it was a production from their point of view, not from the Indian point of view. This is another significant aspect we need to understand. Therefore, whatever the content that went inside later into the text, so these contents were in a way the representation created by the British. So the utilitarians, particularly Jeremy Bentham, James Mill, these people, they were projecting India's history quite contrary to the positions held by the Orientalists. Particularly James Mill, when he published his book, History of British India in 1817 in 3 volumes, he divided India into 3 periods: Hindu India, then Muslim India, and then British India. Even to this day, even whatever that's been happening contemporarily, even by the right wing, is again a reflection of this understanding of Indian history in terms of a Hindu India, Muslim India, and the British India, because there are a number of aspects, which I'll come down to that a little later. So the important aspect here is that during the early part of the British colonial penetration, they indulged in these things, because by indulging in these things, they wanted to know India, and secondly, they wanted to legitimize their powers. Because there was a criticism why the British were interested in in India. Why did they want to establish that political control over India? Why did they want to become the political masters of India? That issue was there. So what was the answer? The answer was this: that look, you're not civilized. We are here to civilize you. So that argument was based on their engaging with the classical text. So that is also a very significant thing that we need to understand. And further, another milestone we need to understand, a very important, a very significant milestone that was created by that was made happen by Macaulay, Lord Macaulay. In 1835, all that Macaulay's minutes, they laid the firm foundation for English education in India. Of course, this came as a follow-up to 1813, their announcement that the missionaries were allowed to enter into India, and they could pursue their different kinds of pursuits. So subsequent to that, when Lord Macaulay minutes were published, that laid the foundation for text-centric curriculum in the Indian schools. Text-centric curriculum. So this was the beginning of a new journey. Text-centric, the text was decided by the government to be taught in the schools, which is a very significant, issue. So in these texts, for the first time, they started, teaching, Indian students, particularly as far as the history was concerned, that India was an uncivilized country. India was a decayed, social system. So therefore, they were trying to, legitimize their political power that they held here. So I would take a quote here from Krishna Kumar, who was very deeply associated with Nehru, Museum and Library in Delhi. He writes, "Let us remind ourselves how colonialism affects the perception of knowledge in a society, and ultimately the curriculum of its schools. Colonized people are forced to accept the image that the colonizer has. The colonizer has. The colonized man is made to look at himself from the point of view of the colonizer, and thus goes through a transformation of identity. So a new identity was created for Indians, and this new identity was the creation of the colonizer or the colonized. So this, it crystallized in different forms into our epistemological, pursuits, and particularly in the, school curriculum. So that is a very important, step that we need to understand. And thereafter, in 1840, they introduced Uniform Code of Rules. So this was another new invention, social invention rather. A Uniform Code of Rules was prepared for the government institutions, and the government prepared a list of books to be taught, in the schools. But a very important and significant point is that these books, these texts were prepared by the British, not the Indians. So therefore, whatever the texts that were prescribed for the students were prepared by the British, and naturally you can understand what kind of an image that they would have built. So the point here is, here is that how the British were trying to give an image that they were here to civilize the people, concealing their internal or the the internal project or the idea that they wanted to legitimize their power in India through these enterprises. So that is another important thing. And thereafter, the Woods Dispatch, which resulted in the establishment of 3 universities and restructuring the educational system, and that gave a very firm foundation for the textual, centric knowledge imparting in India. So this development laid a firm foundation that the state would decide what to be taught in the schools and the colleges. So this is whatever today we are fighting. It is in a way inheritance that we got from the British. Again, I would see a next shift, in this educational price when the natives started, establishing their own schools. And before that, the British themselves laid a foundation for that. They started separate, institutions for the Muslims and separate institutions for the Hindus. And particularly for the Muslims, when they started in 1871, Calcutta Madrasa. So by Hastings, it was started. So naturally, that gave way for Hindus to develop a sense of a crisis, identity crisis. And that sense of identity crisis on the part of the Hindus made them realize that it was time for them to establish schools and colleges. As a result, in 1886, Dayanand Anglo-Vedic school system, which is popularly known as DAV, was started by Lala Hansraj in Lahore. So this was an important development, and they wanted to teach certain aspects, particularly in the school system, and giving emphasis to the native native knowledge systems in these schools. So what was there as the British system prior to 1880s, from 1880s, again there was a shift that Hindus started thinking in terms of starting the new schools. And by starting the new schools, they wanted to give in more space for the native knowledge systems to be imparted in these schools. So that way you would see an academic binary, the binary in the way how these educational institutions were started, and laying the foundation for these binaries of Hindus versus Muslims principle. So this development, in a way, very significant to understand the nature of education being imparted in India during those times. Following this development, now we have to understand the politics of the 1890s and 1900 and after, particularly when we come to the extremist period. These extremists, political extremist nationalists rather, they wanted to give emphasis to the native mode of learning, and they propagated, probably you all know that, to start national schools in India, across India. So what was the purpose of starting these national schools? The main purpose of starting these national schools to infuse more sense of Indianness in the education. So this sense of Indianness in education was a very important shift that we find, and this resulted in starting of a number of national schools across the country, including Karnataka, where we would see a large number of national schools in different parts of Karnataka were started. And through these schools, they wanted to bring in Indianization of education. Indianization. So this was again the reflection of the politics of the period. You know that at the end of the 19th century, the politics was getting binary, in the sense that Hindus were versus Muslim. So that sense of identity that the Hindus, they started thinking in terms of to regain everything what they had thought that they had lost. So this kind of a development is a very significant development, which had a deep bearing on what was taught to children in the schools. So this is another important aspect that we need to understand. Now I'll come down to the post-independence period, because each one of these areas, if we take up for examination for research, I think one could produce volumes about the different aspects, the different dimensions of many of these aspects. So I would come down to the post-independence period, because whatever these efforts that were started then, they continued till 1947, and in fact they continued to exist even after 1947. But a shift that we find only after 1947. So now, after 1947, when we got our independence, when we became an independent republic, a major challenge was to decolonize ourselves. So this was a major challenge, because India was colonized, Indians were colonized, both mind and body were colonized. Now we had to decolonize our minds. How to go about this decolonizing our mind? That was a biggest challenge before India, because every colonized country, once it gets independence, it automatically thinks in terms of decolonizing itself. Erasing a certain sort of memories that the colonizers had created in our minds. So this was, in a way, a major concern even for Indians. So from 1947 onwards, we would see a new kind of a thinking, particularly when it came to pedagogy and the content to be taught in the schools. 1960s are the important days in this respect. Why it's important? They wanted to bring in a national perspective of education. Also equally important is the Marxist school of historiography. It started assuming greater importance in the history research, particularly with the publication of Kosambi's An Introduction to Ancient India in 1956. Thereafterwards, the Marxist school started dominating. Now, why this school became so important? Particularly students of history who have studied the historiography of India, that it phased out itself in different perspectives, and a certain emphasis with each one of these schools. Now, nationalist school, it emphasized on glorifying the past, Indian past. Then the Marxist school, they gave more importance to the material conditions, how that shaped history. They did not give so much of importance to religion. That was the major factor which made this. They believe that they always emphasized on the material issues that were responsible for shaping a society. So the Marxist school, it emerged, and there was a huge conflict between the Marxist school and the nationalist school. So from 1960 onwards, Marxist school became a very, very dominant school in India. That became a dominant narrative insofar as the history was concerned. So this is a very significant thing that we need to understand. In 1961, then government, it established NCERT, a premier national institution for creating textbooks. So this is a major milestone, and this NCERT since then has been in different shades. When Nehruvian era was dominant, when the Congress, governments were dominant, NCRT was quite comfortable with what they were doing. Once the right-wing parties, they assumed over, again the problems started. I'll come to that. So in 1961, NCRT was created. Then MC Chagla was the education minister, and it appointed a committee. So this is a very important thing to be noted. And who are the members on this committee? Very celebrated historians like Tarachen, Nilkant Shastri, then Muhammad Habib, then Vishweshwar Prasad, then BP Saxena, PC Gupta. So these were the important, they were the stalwarts of those times, and they were made the members of a committee to produce the texts to be prescribed or to be studied by students in the schools. Significantly, these people who were there on the committee were not the Marxist historians. They were not known as the Marxist historians. But this committee suggested Romila Thapar to prepare the text, and as a result, Romila Thapar prepared Ancient India and later Medieval India. And from 1966 onwards, the students started studying Ancient India prepared by Romila Thapar for class 6, and medieval period later for class 7. Here it was here that the conflict between the right wing and the left wing, I don't say historians, it was essentially between the left wing historians and the right wing, the political forces majorly. But some people were associated as the ideologues of the right wing were also associated with creating history books. So from then onwards, we see every now and then, if there is any dispute, it's always projected as a dispute between the leftist historians and the rightist historians. In fact, it is not a conflict between the leftist historians and the rightist historians. It is between the professional historians and the politicians affiliated to certain ideological groups. So therefore, it's become one of the major issues, and the textbooks have become casualty. But however, the point to be noted here is that the texts which were then prescribed for the students across the country, almost close to 3.5 decades, they were the one who were, which were taught in the schools. That's a very important thing. So when these texts were, prescribed in 1969, again we have to remember this. The Parliamentary Consultative Committee, it made a suggestion to the government that the government should instruct the historians, particularly insofar as the issue of Aryans were concerned, or the origin of the Aryans were concerned, to bring within the text that Aryans were the natives, they were not outsiders to India. So the Parliamentary Consultative Committee, which suggested that Aryans be projected as the natives and not the foreigners, that became the first bone of contention. It was referred to back to the editorial committee, and this editorial committee, which went through all the material, finally came out with the conclusion that the research suggests, as of now, that the Aryans were outsiders. So therefore, they said that particularly that opinion cannot be withdrawn. It would continue in the text. So therefore, the first sort of a clash was in the year 1869 when the Parliamentary Committee suggested this. Another important issue there was that many Hindu and Sikh organizations particularly, they were very critical of these textbooks, saying that they were for two things. Number one, their heroes, particularly belonging to the Hindu fold and the Sikh fold, they were not adequately eulogized or glorified. And secondly, the criticism on the Muslims was not too adequate. So these were two important things. One, the eulogizing or the glorifying their icons, and number two, too inadequate criticism of the Muslim era were two important points that they raised, particularly when some of these organizations started hue and cry over this. So that is one point. The next important stage was when Janata Party came to power. When Janata Party came to power, you all know that between 1977 and 79, Janata Party was at the center. So Janata Party was a party of many parties, and one of the parties that hugely merged with this party was Janasangh. I think you know Janasangh, Shyam Prasad Mukherjee in 1951. This Janasangh was started. It was a right-wing party, and they had not seen much electoral success. So in 1977, thanks to the emergency declared by Mrs. Gandhi in 1975, elections were fought, and all opposition parties, they came together and they merged into one party called the Janata Party, and Morarji Desai became the prime minister, and the government was formed. So here, again, the issue of these textbooks came up. And one person by name Nanaji Deshmukh, he secretly handed over an anonymous letter to the Prime Minister of India, Mr. Morarji Desai, saying that there were issues with the textbooks, particularly Muslims were not adequately criticized, and secondly, they were given more space than what it was required. We, in fact, historically speaking, that we had a huge political space that should have been reflected in the text, and this has been concealed. So therefore, they raised that these textbooks should be withdrawn and new textbooks to be made. But it couldn't 1789 that government collapsed. That's another trajectory. So here the point is next. The another important significant thing to be noticed here is whenever there was a right-wing party in power or near the power, the issues of these textbooks came up hugely. So what's happening today in Karnataka, which I come to a little later, is this: that at the center and also at the state, they have their own political power center. So naturally, they want to bring in all their own issues into textbooks. That I'll come to a little later. So 1996, Vajpayee, he became the prime minister, but that government survived only for 13 days. And from 1998 to 2004, it was a major period for the the right-wing party, particularly the BJP party. Because what happened in 1799 when the government fell, the earlier Janasangh, it had merged with the new party called Janata Party. Now, once the power was dissolved, they again wanted to go back and have their own independent existence. As a result, in 1980, Bharatiya Janata Party was started. That's the history. So now between 1998 and 2004, okay. So this was a major period, because in 1998, 99 again there were problems, and May 1999 again they went in for elections, and they got a clear mandate, and therefore they survived up to 2004. So here it was during this period you would see a major war of words, a conflict of words between the right-wing, intellectuals and the left-wing, historians or the Marxist historians. On the one side, you would see Romila Thapar, R.S. Sharma, Mridula Mukherjee, Aditya Mukherjee, Irfan Habib, etc. These are the people. And on the other side, you would see J.S. Rajput, Sahasra Buddhi, Dhiranath Batra, Atul Rawat. These were the people you would see on the other side. During 2001 and during 2003, you would see, if you read the literature, particularly relating to textbooks, you would see the high pitch in the conflict between these two dominant schools. So the Marxist historians, their claim was, if we do not toe your line, if we do not accept your logical point, which is not based on the empiricism, based on the study of the material, you would say that we are all Marxists. Yes, we are influenced by the Marxist philosophy. It doesn't mean that we are totally Marxist in our write-up. These kinds of things are there. If you read the huge number of articles that were written by Romila Thapar, Aditya Mukherjee, Mridula Mukherjee, then R.S. Sharma, Irfan Habib, they have written number of articles which are published in different journals and newspapers. And against it, this school, the rightist school, as I told you, J.S. Rajput, Sahasrapati, etc., they also try to put up their fight against these people. There is a very huge literature available for that period. If one is interested, in fact, one could develop a wonderful thesis, on the this issue itself. And in 2003, the right-wing, intellectuals, they brought out a book. This is the book. I think you could see this. History in the new NCERT textbooks, fallacies in the ISC report. ISC means Indian History Congress. So this is the book. If you read this book, they list out what are the errors that have been committed by the leftist historians, against which there were a number of articles being written by the left school historians. So that way you would see during between 1998 and 2014, the textbook battle reached its vocal cords at the top level. So now, after this 10 years, the BJP couldn't come to the power. In 2004, a new committee was appointed, and interestingly, that committee was headed by J.S. Grewal, and Burunde was another member, and Shah Shettar, S. Shettar from Karnataka was yet another member, and they were asked to suggest whether there was anything to be withdrawn in the textbooks or totally the textbooks to be withdrawn. And this committee went in detail with all the texts that were being taught, and they concluded that the texts were fine. There was no necessity for them for the government to withdraw the textbooks. So this is the story between 1998 and 2004. And now 2014 and till now, again, the BJP government is at the center, it's in power, and many attempts have been made to relocate things. Particularly, there are very important, certain very important issues for them. Number one, the issue of Aryans, whether they are the natives or the foreigners. The issue of Sindhu Saraswati Valley, and the third issue is the beef eating issue in the past. So some of these very sensitive issues being hotly debated, and there are contests and counter contests, and that's been happening. But ultimately, what is important for us is to note, as students of history, that anything that any person suggests should be based on empirical study, should be based on a strong research foundations. If there is no research, then there is no history. So therefore, any research should be based on the sound principles of methodology. Only then we can accept certain things or we can reject certain things. Another important thing that we need to understand, we need to always keep in mind, history is not, or teaching history is not merely giving the information. Teaching history means making people to understand, to come out with certain perspectives. So it is always a matter of interpretation. It's always a matter of, if you just give the information, yes, you have the information, but what are you trying to, build up out of this information? So information is there, but what are you trying to say from this information? So you create from information to knowledge. So that is very significant. So history essentially means, it is interpretation. And also we need to understand what is history. At the end of the day, not that all that happened in the past is history. What is written as history is history for us. So therefore, there is always a scope for us to improvise. And this improvisation should be based on a sound research. If there is no research, then where is the question of improvisation? So any change, whether it's the right wing or the left wing or centrist wing, should be based on a sound principle of methodology. If your method suggests based on methodology, you arrive at certain conclusion, then you can bring in those things into textualization. And another important thing, that while preparing the text, it is not necessary that we bring in all these schools and feed the children. What is important for us? Standardization of the textbooks. What is standardization? We need to look at the age of the student or the batch of students, and depending upon the age of students, what level of perspective that need to be given to these students. That is also equally important. When you go up in the academic scale, you have opportunity to read what you want to read, what you want to believe, you would believe. But at this level, we should not distort. And secondly, mere giving information is not teaching history. That also, let's be very clear about it. So what is important, that based on certain research, certain things are there. We may be very unpleasant with certain past. We cannot help it. We can't undo that. It's past. It's happened. We cannot undo that. Now, if Americans want to undo their history related to slaves, they can't undo that. It's a part of their history. It's a part of their memory. Similarly, we too have certain very, very unpleasant parts of our memory, and we can't undo them. We have to accept them. We have to own up them. But how do we move from there to a more civilized level? That should be our concern. Not merely always condemning or criticizing. This is not really important. Yes, that was there, but we are here to rectify that. We are here to move forward. So history, in a way, should be a driving force to move forward, not to take us backward, which is very unfortunately happening. Now I'll come down to the last part of my lecture, that what's happening in Karnataka. Now, it all started in 2014. Incidentally, I was part of the textbook preparation committee. In the committee that gave books in the year 2014, I was heading the class 7 textbook committee. So I was the chairperson for the class 7 textbook committee, which was the overall chairperson was Mudambuditaya then. We prepared the text, and it was published in 2014, and students being taught. I did not see any trouble, any issue from any quarter then. I did, because I was answerable for every query that was raised, and very interestingly, I should submit to you that we did not, as the chairperson, I did not receive any complaints about the textbook that we prepared for 7th standard. So again, there was another committee being formed, because there were issues of saffronization at certain levels. It was being alleged. And then Baragur Ramchandrappa was made the general chairperson for all 27 committees. And incidentally, I was one of the members of this revision committee from 14 onwards. But I was not there on the 7th standard text because 7th standard text was, there was a lot of restructuring about it, which is not relevant here. But I was the member for the revision part of the text related to 8th standard, 9th standard, and 10th standard. So we did not have any problem as such. Now, from 2020 onwards, we have this problem coming up in Karnataka because again these issues, again the organization, again the issue is that in history nobody should have the conclusions, prior conclusion. We need to critically engage with the material. We need to critically question the material. We need to critically establish a dialogue with the material based on these processes. When we arrive at some conclusion, that should become the conclusion. Unfortunately now what is happening is there are conclusions in the minds of some people, some groups, and they want these conclusions to be prescribed in the text, which is against the basic philosophy of history. That is the core aspect why there are conflicts happening now. So now there are so many things have been done, and recently you have noticed in the newspapers, lots of newspapers, these issues are being covered. Now every community has a problem, every religion has a problem. So now where do we go from here? I tell you, now there is a very huge crisis for history. Once we demolish the credibility of a discipline, it is very difficult to bring back that credibility. Now, the major concern for all serious students of history is to think of the credibility being, safeguarded. So that's a major concern. And as a student of history, I would only say that the research, the material, and critical engagement with the material shall be the guiding, teacher, shall be the guiding teacher, not, someone's conclusion, what they have the, constructed, and these constructs to be incorporated into the text because they believe in those constructs. No, that should not happen. And now, if we give away our autonomy as students of history, the legitimacy that history was enjoying would lose itself. Now, it has come to such a stage that the people are telling, we will give it to the certain community heads, we will give the text to certain religious heads, let them scrutiny, let them come, then we will bring it to the public domain, we will publish it. Where are we going? Where are we going? And this, please understand, this tendency did not start now. It was there quite earlier. When Murali Manohar Joshi was the MHRD minister, he made this statement, and I read this statement and then I end my lecture. He said, all, it was in 2002 and 3. He said, all material in textbook connected with religions should be cleared by the heads of the religions concerned before their incorporation in the books. I repeat it again. Murali Manohar Joshi, then MHRD minister, he said all material in textbooks connected with the religions should be cleared by the heads of the religions concerned before their incorporation in the books. This attitude is still become the very dominant attitude. That is what, in a way, our ruling netas are echoing. If this is allowed to take over, I don't know who should save history, from its position that it is enjoyed. Probably globally, it's enjoying.
And imbalance in pre and post independent India. Do you think it as true?
True.
Do you think it's true?
No. We cannot divide a society, any history based on purely religion. Religion is one aspect of the society. It's just one aspect, major aspect. I understand. You read European history or Indian history or any country's history. Religion is a major aspect. I don't deny that. But religion is not the only aspect. When you say that the Hindu period, Hindu means who are the Hindus? Again, there are divisions. Okay. So now there are attempts to redefine this, Hindu, religion. Well, that's a different discussion altogether. There is a huge, efforts being made. So now, but the point is that you cannot brand a period only in terms of a religious, existence. The society also had multidimensional existence. So we can't negate those, other dimensions and fixing only the religious dimension. That is basically against the principle of history.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
The next question is, as Marxism or leftist historians also politically promote certain ideologies, I would request others to mute themselves. Thank you. I'll just repeat, sir. As Marxism or leftist historians also were politically promoted once, why not rightist thinkers of history cannot be called as historians?
Whether he is a left historian or the rightist historian, what is the difference? The leftist historian draws his, analogy from Marx. The rightist historian draws his analogy from the perspective of the religion. Okay. So now, as students of history, we cannot see that history being appropriated by either by this school or that school. This is what I was telling at the end. History should be any perspective that you build. It should be based on your empirical data and the critical engagement that you have the empirical you have with the empirical data. That shall be the solely deciding factor, not that who belongs to which wing, whether the right wing or the left wing. I understand when the left, when the left has a domination, the right also has its own, times to claim that yes, it's now our time. We will do what we want. We want to do. Yes, I understand. These binary things are happening all through history. It's not very new, and it's not just confined to history also. But the point here is that for a serious student of history, both these streams are not acceptable. You have these perspectives to understand history. You have them, absolutely no issue. But when it comes to reflecting certain history of certain period or certain communities or certain state, you have to be objective. Be loyal to what you infer from the document based on your critical understanding.
Thank you, sir. The next question is, what is the political logic beyond the misrepresentation of history in India?
Sorry, I didn't get it.
What is the political logic beyond the misrepresentation of history in India?
What does it mean? What is the political logic? Is there a political logic there? I think I feel that it should be rephrased by the person who has asked that question.
Okay, so the last question is, as a teacher, how should one deal with left and right wing's thoughts at the stage of school education and pre-university education?
Yes, it's a very, very important concern. Now, don't bring in right or the left at the school level. Don't bring in there. You bring in what are the the common what should I say, understanding of certain aspects based on someone's research. You have to prescribe for the students. It does not mean that we avoid of certain aspects where you have these contrary debates, claims and counterclaims. Okay, but they should be given to students in a minuscule, not in a major scale. in a major dose. So students should feel that, this text, somewhere I'm there in the text. What is the purpose of studying history? Purpose of studying history is to see myself if I'm there in the text. In some fashion, I need to connect myself with the sense of history, and that sense of history I should get through the text, but that should not be on the extreme terminology. You should bring in to the moderate level. If there is truth in this wing, draw certain things. If there is truth in this wing, draw certain things. You just standardize them and give them in a minuscule. When they grow up, they will take care of it. Whether he would accept that school, or he would accept, or she would accept this school. Let them decide. So there should be a sense of moderation when we give students a certain perspective of history.
Thank you, sir. I think that was the last question. And thank you so much. I think it's a very important message that you gave today about the teaching of history and the dissemination of information. So thank you so much for spending time with us today, sir. It was a very interesting session to be a part of. So thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.